The rain was falling hard against the window of the small office. It was a grey Tuesday afternoon in the coastal town of Blackwood. Robert sat at his wooden desk. He was a private investigator. He was 45 years old and had lived in this town all his life. He liked the quiet, but sometimes the quiet was boring. Today, however, felt different. The office smelled like old paper and cold coffee. Robert looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3 o'clock. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. It was a slow, heavy knock. Robert stood up and smoothed his shirt. He wanted to look professional. "Come in," he said in a clear voice. The door opened. A woman walked into the room. She was tall and wore a long, expensive coat. Her hair was perfectly white, and she wore silver rings on her fingers. She looked around the small office with a serious expression. This was Mrs. Sterling. Everyone in town knew her family. They were the richest people in Blackwood. They lived in a giant mansion on the hill. "Mr. Robert?" she asked. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Yes. Please sit down, Mrs. Sterling," Robert replied. He pointed to the leather chair across from his desk. Mrs. Sterling sat down. She held her black handbag very tightly in her lap. Robert noticed her hands were shaking just a little bit. He did not say anything about it. He waited for her to speak first. He knew that people often needed a moment to find their words when they were worried. "I have a very serious problem," she began. She looked into Robert's eyes. "Something was taken from my house last night. It is a very important object." Robert leaned forward. He was interested now. He took out a small notebook and a pen. "What was taken, exactly?" he asked. "A painting," Mrs. Sterling said. "But it is not just any painting. It is a family treasure. My father gave it to me many years ago. It is worth a lot of money, but it is also very important to our family history. It shows the harbor as it looked 100 years ago." "Was the house locked?" Robert asked. "Yes," she said. "The doors were locked. The alarm was on. The windows were closed. But this morning, the wall in the gallery was empty. There were no broken windows. There was no mess. The painting was just gone. It is like a ghost took it." Robert looked out the window. The rain was still falling. The street outside was empty and dark. He turned back to Mrs. Sterling. He saw the fear in her eyes. "I will help you," he said. "I will come to your house and look at the gallery. But tell me one thing, Mrs. Sterling. Why would someone want to steal it now? The painting has been there for years." Mrs. Sterling looked at the office door to make sure it was closed. Then she looked back at Robert. "I think someone is watching me," she whispered. "For the last 3 nights, I have seen a shadow in the rain outside my window. I think the thief is still near." Robert wrote the words, "The Blue Harbor," in his notebook. He looked at the name and then at Mrs. Sterling. He wanted to know more about the people in her life. "Who lives in the house with you, Mrs. Sterling?" Robert asked. "Only my cook, Martha, and my gardener, Mr. Green," she answered. "But yesterday was their day off. They were both in the city. They only returned this morning after I found the empty wall. They were very surprised." "And your family?" Robert asked. Mrs. Sterling paused for a moment. She looked down at her rings. "My brother, Victor, lives in the town, but we do not talk very often. He is a difficult man. He likes to spend money that he does not have." Robert nodded. He knew about Victor Sterling. People in town talked about him. Victor was often at the local card club late at night. He often lost a lot of money. I need to see the gallery now. Robert said. I want to see exactly where the painting was. I also want to check the locks on the doors. Mrs. Sterling stood up. My car is outside. We can go together. Robert stood up too. He took his long grey coat from the rack near the door. He grabbed his large, black umbrella. The wind was getting stronger outside. He could hear the rain hitting the roof of the building with a steady, heavy rhythm. It was a cold and lonely sound. They walked down the stairs of the old office building. The stairs were made of thick wood. They made a low, creaking noise under their feet as they walked down to the first floor. At the bottom of the stairs, Robert opened the heavy front door. A cold wind blew into the hallway and moved the papers on a small table. Wait here for a moment, Robert said. He opened his umbrella and stepped out onto the wet sidewalk. He walked to a large, black car parked at the curb. A driver in a dark suit opened the back door for Mrs. Sterling. Robert decided to take his own car. He liked to have his own tools with him. He also wanted to be able to leave quickly if he found a new clue. I will follow you, Robert told her. He walked to his small, blue car. It was old, but it worked well in the rain. He started the engine, and the car made a low humming sound. He turned on the wipers to clear the heavy rain from the glass. He followed the black car through the narrow, wet streets of Blackwood. The town looked very grey today. Most people were inside their warm houses. They passed the small shops, the cafe, and the old library. Then, the road began to go up the hill. The trees on the hill were tall and dark. Their branches moved in the wind like thin arms. At the top of the hill, Robert saw the gates of the Sterling mansion. They were made of heavy black iron. The gates opened slowly and made a long, scraping sound against the ground. The mansion was very large. It had many windows and a high, dark roof. It looked like a castle from a very old book. Robert parked his car near the front door. He felt a small shiver, but not from the cold. There was something strange about this house today. It was too quiet. He walked to the front door. Mrs. Sterling was waiting for him. She looked very pale in the grey light of the afternoon. Please, come inside, Mr. Robert, she said. The gallery is this way. They entered a large hall with a white marble floor. Their footsteps made a sharp, echoing sound on the cold stone as they walked toward the back of the house. The gallery was a long, narrow room at the back of the mansion. The walls were painted a soft grey, and the ceiling was very high. Many paintings hung on the walls. There were pictures of mountains, old ships, and people from the past. However, in the center of the main wall, there was a large, empty space. Robert walked to the empty spot. He could see a faint line on the wall where the frame used to be. The dust on the wall showed that the painting had been there for a long time. This is where it was, Mrs. Sterling said. She stood by the door. She did not want to come closer. It is a beautiful painting. I cannot believe it is gone. Robert did not speak. He took a small flashlight from his coat pocket. He turned it on. The light was bright and white. He began to look at the floor. The floor was made of dark wood. It was very clean and polished. Robert moved the light slowly from left to right. He looked for footprints, but he saw nothing. The thief was very careful. He walked to the window at the end of the gallery. He checked the lock. It was a heavy brass lock. There were no marks on the metal. The window was closed tightly. The rain continued to hit the glass. It made a steady, rhythmic sound. Robert looked out into the garden. It was dark and full of shadows. Did you hear anything last night, Mrs. Sterling? Robert asked. He was still looking at the floor near the window. No, she said. I sleep on the second floor. The rain was very loud last night. I only heard the wind. Robert moved his flashlight again. Suddenly, he saw a small sparkle. It was near the corner of the room, half hidden under a heavy velvet curtain. He knelt on the floor. He used a pair of small metal tools to pick up the object. It was a small piece of blue glass. It was thick and had a curved shape. It looked like a piece of a broken bottle or a lamp. It was a deep, dark blue color. "Do you have anything in this room made of blue glass, Mrs. Sterling?" Robert asked. He held the small piece up to the light. Mrs. Sterling walked into the room. She looked at the glass in Robert's hand. She shook her head. "No, I do not like blue glass. All the vases in this house are clear or green. I have never seen that before." Robert placed the blue glass into a small plastic bag. This was his first real clue. It did not belong in the gallery. It was a strange object to find in such a clean house. "Is there anyone in town who works with glass?" Robert asked. "There is an old shop near the docks." Mrs. Sterling remembered. "Mr. Finch owns it. He repairs old lamps and windows. He also knows a lot about the local history." Robert looked at the empty wall one more time. The mystery was growing. A painting was gone from a locked room, and a piece of blue glass was left behind. He thought about the shadow Mrs. Sterling saw in the rain. "I will visit Mr. Finch tomorrow morning," Robert said. "But for now, I want to check the rest of the house." The next morning, the rain was lighter, but a thick fog covered the town. Robert drove his car down the hill toward the docks. The air smelled of salt and wet wood. He parked in front of a small, dusty shop. The sign above the door said, "Finch's Glass and Art." Robert pushed the door open. The shop was crowded with old things. There were tall lamps, glass vases, and many stacks of picture frames. In the back of the room, a man was working at a large table. This was Mr. Finch. He was a small man with white hair and large glasses. "Good morning," Robert said. Mr. Finch jumped. He looked very surprised to see a visitor so early. He quickly put his hands under the table. Robert noticed this immediately. "Oh, Mr. Robert, you scared me," Mr. Finch said. He tried to smile, but he looked nervous. His face was very pale. "I am sorry," Robert said. He walked closer to the table. "I am working for Mrs. Sterling. She has a problem." When Robert said the name Sterling, Mr. Finch's eyes grew wide. He moved a heavy cloth over something on his desk. "Mrs. Sterling. I haven't seen her in weeks," Mr. Finch said. His voice was shaking. "She lost a painting last night," Robert explained. "The one of the old harbor. Did you know she had it?" "Everyone knows about that painting," Mr. Finch replied. He stayed behind his desk. He did not move his hands. "It is very famous in this town. But why are you asking me? I am just a simple shop owner." Robert took the small plastic bag from his pocket. He showed the piece of blue glass to Mr. Finch. "I found this in her gallery," Robert said. "It is a very specific color. Do you recognize it?" Mr. Finch leaned forward to look at the glass, but he kept his hands hidden. He looked at the blue glass for a long time. He did not say anything for a minute. The only sound in the room was the quiet ticking of an old clock on the wall. "Blue glass is common," Mr. Finch said finally. "Many bottles are blue. I cannot tell you where that came from. It could be from anywhere. It is a very thick piece of glass, Mr. Finch," Robert said. "It looks like it belongs to a lantern. An old lantern." Mr. Finch stepped back. He looked around his shop as if he wanted to run away. "I don't know anything about lanterns. Now, please, I have a lot of work to do. I must ask you to leave." Robert did not leave. He looked at the table. He saw a small drop of red on the white cloth. It looked like blood. "Are you okay, Mr. Finch? Your hand is bleeding," Robert said. Mr. Finch pulled his right hand out from under the table. There was a long, fresh cut across his palm. He quickly covered it with a handkerchief. "It was just an accident," Mr. Finch said quickly. "I broke a vase this morning. It is nothing." Robert knew the man was lying. The cut looked like it came from a sharp piece of glass. Perhaps the same glass Robert found in the mansion. Robert looked into Mr. Finch's eyes. He saw fear. "If you remember anything about the painting, call me," Robert said. He turned and walked out of the shop. He knew Mr. Finch was hiding something important. Robert left the glass shop and walked toward the water. The fog was very thick now. He could not see the tops of the buildings. He could only see the wet ground and the dark shapes of the boats. The air was cold and smelled of salt and old fish. He pulled his coat collar up to protect his neck from the wind. He walked along the wooden pier. The wood was slippery under his boots. He found a quiet spot near the end of the pier and looked out at the sea. He thought about Mr. Finch. Why was the man so nervous? Why did he have a cut on his hand? It was possible that Mr. Finch was in the gallery that night. Suddenly, Robert felt a strange sensation. He felt like someone was watching him. He turned his head slowly. About 50 meters away, a tall figure stood near a stack of wooden crates. The person wore a long, dark raincoat and a hat pulled low over their face. The figure did not move. It looked like a shadow in the grey fog. Robert started to walk toward the person. "Excuse me," he called out. The person did not answer. Instead, the figure turned and walked quickly behind a large warehouse. Robert began to run. His boots made a heavy, rhythmic sound on the wet wood of the pier. He turned the corner of the warehouse, but the man was gone. There were many paths between the buildings, and it was easy to hide in the fog. Robert stopped to catch his breath. He saw an old man sitting on a wooden bench under a small roof. The man was wearing a yellow sailor's jacket. He was smoking a pipe, and the smoke smelled like sweet tobacco. This was Sam. Sam had spent his whole life on boats and knew everything about the Blackwood docks. "Hello, Sam," Robert said. "Hello, Robert," Sam replied. His voice was deep and rough like sand. "You look like you are chasing a ghost." "Maybe I am," Robert said. "I'm looking for a man in a dark raincoat. Did you see him pass by?" Sam shook his head slowly. "Many men wear raincoats in this town, Robert. It is always raining here. But that man, I have seen him before. He watches the water at night. He stays in the shadows." Robert sat down on the bench next to Sam. "Sam, have you heard anything strange lately? Any new boats or unusual people at the docks?" Sam looked at the dark water for a long moment. He looked like he was thinking very hard. "Well," he said finally, "there is a small boat that comes in late at night. Maybe 2 or 3 times a week. It does not have a name on the side. And it uses a strange light. Not a white light or a red light." Robert leaned forward. "What color is the light, Sam?" "It is blue," Sam said. "A very dark, deep blue. It is an old-fashioned lantern. I haven't seen a blue lantern in this harbor for 20 years. Robert thought about the piece of blue glass in his pocket. The mystery was starting to come together. Robert sat with Sam for a long time. The fog was cold, but the conversation was important. Sam was an old friend of Robert's father. He knew the history of every family in Blackwood. He especially knew about the Sterling family. Tell me more about those blue lanterns, Sam. Robert said. He watched a small boat move slowly through the water. Sam took a deep breath. Many years ago, the Sterling family had a large fleet of fishing boats. They were the kings of this harbor. They used blue lanterns on their boats at night. It was a tradition. People said the blue light helped the sailors find their way home in the thickest fog. But you said you haven't seen one in 20 years. Robert reminded him. That is true. Sam replied. When Mrs. Sterling's father died, the fishing business stopped. The boats were sold or left to rot. The blue lanterns disappeared. That is why it is so strange to see one now. It is like a ghost from the past has returned to the docks. Robert looked at the piece of blue glass in the plastic bag. The painting that was stolen shows the old harbor. Do you think there is a connection? Sam nodded his head slowly. The painting is more than just art. Robert. It shows the harbor exactly as it was when the Sterling family was powerful. Some people say there are secrets hidden in those old images. Secrets about money and secrets about the sea. What about Victor Sterling? Robert asked. Does he come down to the docks? Sam laughed, but it was a dry, unhappy sound. Victor. He only comes here when he needs a boat to take him away from his debts. He does not like the smell of fish or the hard work of the sailors. But I saw him 2 nights ago. He was talking to a man in a dark raincoat near the old warehouse. Robert stood up. This was a very important detail. Which warehouse? Sam. Sam pointed a thin, shaking finger toward the end of the pier. The old Sterling warehouse. It is number 42. No one uses it now. The windows are broken and the roof is weak. It is a dangerous place. Thank you, Sam. Robert said. He reached into his pocket and offered the old man some money for a warm meal. Sam shook his head. No, Robert. Just find that painting. This town feels different lately. There is a heavy feeling in the air, and it is not just the rain. Robert walked back to his car. The fog was starting to lift, but the sky was still dark. He looked at the warehouse in the distance. It stood alone against the grey sky. It looked cold and empty. He knew he had to go there, but not yet. He needed more information first. He decided to go back to his office to check some old records about the Sterling fleet. As he drove away from the docks, he looked in his mirror. The tall figure in the raincoat was standing in the middle of the road, watching him go. Robert returned to his office. The room felt colder than usual. He did not turn on the main light. Instead, he used the small lamp on his desk. The yellow light created long shadows on the walls. He sat down and took the small piece of blue glass out of the plastic bag. He held it close to the lamp. The glass was a beautiful, deep color. It was much thicker than a normal bottle. He remembered a collection of old books in the corner of his office. His father had been a history teacher in Blackwood. When he died, he left Robert many books about the town and the sea. Robert walked to the tall wooden shelf and looked for a specific book. It was a large book with a dark green cover. The title was The History of the Blackwood Harbor. He sat back at his desk and began to turn the pages. The paper was old and yellow. It had a dry, dusty smell. He looked at old photos of the docks from 80 years ago. Finally, he found a chapter called The Sterling Fleet. There was a drawing of a large wooden ship. At the front of the ship, a man held a large lantern. The book explained that the Sterling family owned the most successful fishing boats in the area. To show which boats were theirs, they used special lanterns. These lanterns did not use clear glass. They used a rare type of blue cobalt glass from Europe. The Blue Lanterns of Blackwood. Robert read aloud. His voice was a quiet whisper in the empty room. The book said that these lanterns were very expensive and rare. Only 12 were ever made. They were famous because the blue light could be seen from a long distance, even in the worst storms. But the book also mentioned a darker secret. Some people believed the blue light was a signal. It told other boats when it was safe to bring secret goods into the harbor without the police seeing them. Robert looked at the piece of glass again. He was now certain it was from one of those 12 lanterns. If a thief was using a blue lantern today, it was not just a light. It was a message. It was a connection to the old Sterling family secrets. He wondered who could have such a rare object. Perhaps Victor Sterling had found one in the family mansion. Or perhaps the man in the raincoat was a relative of an old sailor who worked for the family. Robert took out his map of the town. He marked the Sterling mansion and the old warehouse near the docks. Then, he looked at the location of the old lighthouse. All these places were connected to the Sterling history. Suddenly, the telephone on his desk rang. The sound was sharp in the quiet office. Robert picked it up. "Hello," he said. There was no answer. He could hear the sound of someone breathing on the other end. Then, a low voice spoke. "The blue light shows the way, Robert. But the way is dangerous. Stop now." The line went dead. Robert held the phone for a long time. He felt a chill in the room. Someone knew he had the glass. Someone was watching his every move. Robert did not sleep well after the phone call. The voice was cold and stayed in his mind all night. The next morning, he decided to return to the Sterling mansion. He needed to see the security videos. If someone entered the house, the cameras surely saw them. The rain was still falling, but it was light now. Robert drove up the hill. The large iron gates opened for him again. He felt more nervous this time. He felt that the house was hiding something from him. He parked his car and walked to the front door. Mrs. Sterling opened the door before he could even knock. "Mr. Robert, you look tired," she said. She was wearing a dark blue dress today. She looked elegant but very pale. "I'm fine, thank you," Robert replied. "I want to see the security room. I need to check the videos from the night the painting disappeared." Mrs. Sterling nodded. "Of course. Follow me. The security room is near the library. My husband installed the cameras 10 years ago. We have a lot of cameras inside and outside the house." They walked down a long hallway. The walls were covered with old wallpaper. Robert saw many expensive things: gold clocks, silver vases, and fine furniture. They reached a small, heavy door. Mrs. Sterling took a silver key from her pocket and opened it. The security room was small and dark. There were 4 large computer monitors on a desk. The screens showed different parts of the house. One screen showed the front gate. Another showed the garden. The third screen showed the main hall, and the fourth screen showed the gallery. Robert sat down at the desk. He looked at the fourth screen. The gallery was empty and quiet. He began to use the computer to look at the recordings from 2 nights ago. He moved the clock on the screen back to 11 o'clock at night. "I went to bed at 10 o'clock," Mrs. Sterling said. She stood behind him and watched the screen. Robert watched the video. He moved the time forward slowly. 11:30, 12 o'clock, 12:30. The gallery remained empty. The lights were low. Then, something strange happened. At exactly 1 o'clock in the morning, the screen suddenly went black. There was no image. Robert tried to move the video forward, but there was nothing to see. He checked the time. 1:15, 1:30, 2 o'clock. The screen stayed black until 4 o'clock in the morning. At 4 o'clock, the image of the gallery returned. Everything looked the same, but the painting was gone. "The video is deleted," Robert said. He felt a heavy feeling in his stomach. Deleted. How? Mrs. Sterling asked. She looked shocked. I don't know how to use this computer. Only the security company and my brother Victor know the password. Robert looked at the computer more closely. This was not an accident. Someone knew exactly where to go and what to do. They did not just turn off the camera. They removed the files from the computer. He looked at the small door of the security room. Who has a key to this room? Mrs. Sterling. Only me, she said. Then she paused. But Victor has a key to the house. He often comes here when I am not home. Robert stood up. The mystery was becoming more dangerous. The thief was not a ghost. The thief was someone who knew the house very well. Robert thanked Mrs. Sterling and walked out of the big house. The air was very cold now. The rain was not light anymore. It was coming down hard again. The wind moved the tall trees in the garden. The branches made a low, rubbing sound against each other. It was a very lonely and dark place. He walked quickly to his small blue car. He reached for the door handle. Then, he stopped. He saw something on the front window. It was a small, white piece of paper. It was held down by the windshield wiper. The paper was wet from the rain. But it was still there. Robert took the paper. He sat inside his car and closed the door. He felt a little safer inside the small space. He turned on the small light in the car. He opened the wet paper very carefully so it did not tear. The ink was black and thick. The writing was in big, angry letters. Stop looking if you want to stay safe. The note said. Robert felt a cold shiver on his back. He looked out the car window. He looked at the tall grass and the dark bushes of the garden. Was someone hiding there right now? Was someone watching him read the note? The mansion was far from other houses. The garden was very big. No one could hear him if he called for help. He started the car engine. The motor made a loud, steady humming sound. He turned on his headlights. The bright beams of light hit the falling rain. For a second, Robert thought he saw a person standing near a large oak tree. The person wore a long, dark coat. But when Robert looked again, there was nothing there. There was only the wind and the moving shadows of the branches. He drove away from the mansion quickly. His heart was beating fast in his chest. He was a private investigator, so he was used to difficult situations. But this felt different. This felt personal. Someone knew his car. Someone knew he was at the mansion. Someone was following him. He thought about Victor Sterling. Did Victor put the note there? Or was it the man in the raincoat? Or maybe it was Mr. Finch from the glass shop. Robert reached the bottom of the hill. He saw the orange lights of the town in the distance. He felt a little better. He decided he could not go home to his empty apartment yet. He was too nervous to be alone. He needed to be around people. He drove toward the center of town. He looked at the note again. The paper was starting to dry. He put it into a small plastic bag. This was his second real clue. The first clue was the blue glass. The second clue was this warning. The mystery was not just about a missing painting anymore. It was about a hidden danger in the town of Blackwood. And that danger was now following Robert. Robert did not stay in the town center for long. He was too restless to sit in a cafe. He remembered something Mrs. Sterling mentioned during their first meeting. She owned a small beach house on the far side of the bay. She said it was her favorite place to think because it was very isolated. Robert felt a sudden urge to check it. If someone was following him, maybe they were also watching her other properties. The drive to the coast took 20 minutes. The road was narrow and winding. There were no streetlights here, and the thick trees blocked the moonlight. The only light came from the yellow beams of his car. The rain was heavy again, and the wind pushed against the side of his vehicle. He could hear the ocean now. The waves were hitting the shore with a powerful, rhythmic force. He reached the end of the road. The beach house stood alone on a small hill of sand. It was a white wooden building with a wide porch. It looked dark and empty. Robert parked his car behind a large bush. He turned off the engine and the lights. He sat in the silence for a minute, listening. He wanted to be sure no other cars were nearby. He stepped out of the car. The wind was very cold. It carried the smell of salt and wet sand. Robert walked toward the house. He kept his head down to protect his eyes from the rain. He reached the front door and turned the handle. It was locked. He walked around to the back of the house, the side that faced the dark sea. He stopped moving. The back door was not closed. It was open a few inches, moving slowly back and forth in the wind. It hit the frame with a low, dull sound every time the wind blew. Robert felt his muscles go tight. He reached into his coat and took out his heavy flashlight. He did not turn it on yet. He pushed the door open all the way. He stepped into the kitchen. The air inside was freezing. It felt like no one had lived there for a long time. But the smell was different. It did not smell dusty. It smelled like wet wool and smoke. "Is anyone there?" Robert called out. His voice was steady, but no one replied. He turned on his flashlight. The bright beam of light cut through the darkness. He saw a wooden table and two simple chairs. He moved the light across the floor. There were wet footprints on the white rug. They were large, muddy prints that led from the kitchen into the small living room. Robert followed the tracks. He was very quiet. He reached the living room and moved his light to the center table. He saw an object that made his breath stop. It was a large, old lantern. The glass was a deep, dark blue. It was exactly like the piece of glass he had in his pocket. Next to the lantern was a small, silver key. He walked to the table and touched the glass of the lantern. It was warm. Someone had been using it only a few minutes ago. He looked toward the dark hallway that led to the bedroom. He knew he was not alone in the house. Robert stood in the center of the kitchen. He held his flashlight tightly. He did not move for a long minute. He wanted to hear if someone was breathing in the dark. But there was only the loud sound of the waves and the wind. The house felt cold and sad. He walked into the living room. The light from his flashlight hit a wooden chair. It was on the floor. One of the legs was broken. It was a clean break. Someone had used a lot of force. Robert knelt down to look at the floor. He saw more mud. He also saw a small piece of dark blue thread on the broken wood. It was the same color as the glass he had found earlier. "Hello," he said again. His voice felt small in the large, dark house. He moved to the small bedroom. The door was wide open. He saw a bed with white covers. The pillows were on the floor, and the blankets were messy. Someone had searched this room in a hurry. He opened the closet. There were only a few old coats and a pair of boots. There was no one hiding inside. Robert went back to the living room table. He looked at the blue lantern. It was a very old object. The blue glass was thick and beautiful, but the metal was covered in rust. He touched the top of the lantern. It was still a little warm to the touch. The person who was here left only a few minutes ago. Next to the lantern was a small, silver key. Robert picked it up. It was light and had a small letter S carved into the top. It was likely a key for a small box or a drawer. He put the key into his pocket for safety. He felt that this key was very important. He heard a soft noise from the back porch. It was the sound of a foot stepping on a loose board. Robert turned off his flashlight immediately. The room became pitch black. He stood very still. He held his breath. He waited for a sound, but everything was quiet again. He walked to the window and looked out. The rain was heavy, and the beach was a wall of grey and black. For a moment, He thought he saw a tall shadow standing near the water. The shadow was not moving. It was just watching the house. Robert watched the shadow for a long time. Then, a large wave hit the shore, and when the water went back, the shadow was gone. Robert realized he was in danger. He was alone in an isolated house, and someone was playing a game with him. He decided to leave. He took the blue lantern with him and walked quickly to his car. He did not look back until he was safely inside with the doors locked. He needed to find Mrs. Sterling's brother, Victor. He felt that Victor knew exactly what was happening at this beach house. Robert drove back to the center of Blackwood. The town felt different at night. The bright lights of the shops were off, and only the streetlights cast a yellow glow on the wet pavement. He knew exactly where to find Victor Sterling. Victor spent most of his nights at a place called the Anchor Club. It was a private club for men who liked to play cards and talk about the old days. Robert parked his car across the street from the club. The building was made of grey stone and had no windows on the ground floor. He walked to the heavy wooden door. A large man in a suit stood outside. He looked at Robert for a long moment, then opened the door. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of expensive tobacco. The lights were very low. In the center of the main room, several men sat around a green table. They were playing cards in total silence. Robert saw Victor Sterling sitting in a corner by himself. Victor was younger than his sister, but he looked much older. His face was thin, and his eyes were red from a lack of sleep. He was staring at a small glass on the table. Robert walked over and sat down in the chair across from him. Victor did not look up. "I found a blue lantern tonight, Victor," Robert said quietly. Victor's hand moved suddenly, spilling a little of his drink. He looked up at Robert. His eyes were full of fear. "What are you talking about? Why are you following me?" "I am not following you," Robert replied. "I am looking for your sister's painting. I went to the beach house. The back door was open. I found the lantern there, and a silver key." Victor laughed, but the sound was not happy. It was the sound of a man who was very tired. "That house is a ruin. No one goes there. You should stay away from the beach, Robert. It is a dangerous place for a man who asks too many questions." Robert leaned forward. He saw a piece of paper sticking out of Victor's coat pocket. It looked like a bill from a bank. It had overdue written on it in bright red letters. "You need money, Victor. A lot of money. Did you take the painting to pay your debts?" Victor's face turned red. He stood up so quickly that his chair fell over. The sound of the chair hitting the floor made the other men in the room stop their game and look over. "I did not take the painting," Victor whispered angrily. "I love my sister. But there are people in this town who are much more dangerous than me. People who remember what our father did. They want what they think is theirs." "Who are they, Victor?" Robert asked. "I can't say," Victor said. He looked toward the door of the club. "If I tell you, I am a dead man. Just look at the old warehouse. That is all I will tell you." Victor turned and walked quickly toward the back exit of the club. Robert did not follow him. He knew he had found a new piece of the puzzle. Victor was not the thief, but he was hiding a secret to protect himself. The rain was still falling when Robert walked out of the club. The cold air hit his face, and he pulled his coat tight. He looked at the dark street. It was empty and quiet. He thought about what Victor said. Warehouse 42. It was a place for secrets and old ghosts. As Robert walked toward his car, he stopped. Across the street, near a narrow alley, he saw a tall figure. The man was wearing a long, dark raincoat and a hat. It was the same shadow he had seen before. The man was standing perfectly still under a broken streetlight. He was looking directly at Robert. "Hey!" Robert called out. The man did not answer. He turned and ran into the dark alley. Robert did not wait. He started to run, too. His boots made a heavy sound on the wet pavement. He reached the entrance of the alley and looked inside. It was very dark and smelled like wet trash and salt. He could see the man at the other end, moving fast toward the docks. Robert followed him. They ran through the foggy streets of the lower town. The fog was so thick that Robert could only see a few meters in front of him. He almost lost the man twice, but he could hear the sound of the raincoat moving in the wind. They reached the dock area. The smell of the ocean was very strong here. The ground was made of old, slippery wood. Large cranes stood over the water like giant metal birds. The man in the raincoat stopped in front of a very large building. It was made of grey metal and red bricks. Above the door, there was a faded number, 42. The man looked back one last time. His face was still hidden in the shadows of his hat. Then, he opened a small side door and disappeared inside. Robert reached the building a minute later. He was breathing hard. He looked at the door. It was old and the paint was peeling. He touched the metal handle. It was cold. He pushed the door, but it did not open. It was locked from the inside. He walked around the side of the warehouse. He looked for a window or another way in. The building was very tall and dark. Most of the windows were high up and covered in dirt. Finally, he found a small window near the ground. The glass was broken. Robert took a deep breath. He knew it was dangerous to enter a dark warehouse alone at night. But he also knew that the painting, and the truth, was likely inside. He used his flashlight to look through the broken window. Inside, he saw tall stacks of wooden boxes and long rows of metal shelves. He carefully climbed through the window. He was inside Warehouse 42. The air was dusty and very quiet. He turned off his flashlight. He did not want the man in the raincoat to see his light. He stood in the shadows and waited. He heard a soft sound from the other side of the room. It was the sound of a heavy door closing. Robert stood perfectly still in the dark warehouse. The air was cold and smelled of old wood, salt, and dust. He waited for a long time. He wanted his eyes to get used to the darkness. Slowly, the shapes of large wooden crates and tall metal shelves appeared. The warehouse was much bigger than it looked from the outside. He did not turn on his flashlight. He did not want the man in the raincoat to see him. He moved slowly along the wall. His feet made no noise on the dusty floor. He reached a row of large crates. They were stacked high, almost touching the ceiling. He felt small among the giant boxes. Robert heard a distant sound. It was the sound of a heavy door closing somewhere deep in the building. He followed the sound. He walked past more crates and old machinery. He saw a small room with glass walls in the middle of the warehouse floor. It looked like an office for the workers. He walked to the office and looked through the glass. It was empty. He moved past it and found a large wooden table. The table was covered with a white cloth. Robert took out his flashlight. He covered the light with his hand so only a small beam came out. He turned it on. On the table, he saw something very strange. There were 5 or 6 picture frames. They were large, heavy frames made of gold and dark wood. They looked very expensive and very old. But the frames were empty. The paintings had been removed. Robert looked closely at the wood. He saw small pieces of canvas still stuck to the edges. Someone had used a sharp knife to cut the paintings out of their frames. Robert searched the table for the blue harbor painting. He looked at every frame. One frame was the exact size of the empty space on Mrs. Sterling's wall. He touched the gold edge. It was cold. But the painting was not there. Why take the frames? Robert whispered to himself. He realized that paintings are easier to carry and hide without their heavy frames. A person could roll a painting up and put it in a bag. This was the work of a professional thief. Robert moved his flashlight to the floor under the table. He saw more pieces of blue glass. They were small and sharp. It looked like a blue lantern had broken here recently. He also saw a small piece of paper. He picked it up. It was a receipt from a shipping company. The date on the receipt was today. Suddenly, Robert heard a footstep behind him. He turned his light off and dropped to the floor. He hid under the heavy wooden table. He held his breath. He heard the sound of someone walking slowly toward the table. The person was wearing heavy boots. The footsteps were steady and confident. Through the shadows, Robert saw a pair of black boots stop right next to the table. The person stood there for a long time. Robert could hear the person breathing. It was a slow, calm sound. Then, the person turned and walked away toward the back of the warehouse. Robert waited until he could not hear the footsteps anymore. He crawled out from under the table. He knew he could not stay here. He had to find out where those paintings were going. Robert climbed out of the broken window of the warehouse. He was careful not to make a sound. The air outside was even colder now, and the fog was like a thick, white wall. He could not see his car, but he could hear the sound of the ocean. The waves were hitting the pier with a steady rhythm. He did not go back to his car. Instead, he walked toward the water. He remembered the small boat that Sam mentioned, the one with the blue lantern. He moved slowly between the large stacks of wood and metal. Suddenly, he heard voices. They were low and quiet, but they were close. Robert hid behind a large green crate. He looked around the corner. About 10 meters away, a small wooden boat sat in the water. A single lamp hung from a pole on the boat, but it was not lit. 2 men were standing on the pier next to the boat. Robert's eyes went wide. He recognized the first man immediately. It was Mr. Finch, the owner of the glass shop. He looked even more nervous than before. He was wearing a heavy grey coat and holding a small leather bag. The second man was tall and wore a yellow sailor's jacket. It was Sam. Robert felt a sharp pain in his chest. Sam was his father's old friend. He was the person Robert trusted most in this town. But here he was, standing in the dark with a man who was hiding the truth. "Is everything ready?" Mr. Finch asked. His voice was shaking. "The boat is ready," Sam replied. His voice was deep and calm. "We just need to wait for the signal from the mansion. The lady wants everything gone before the sun comes up." "I don't like this, Sam," Mr. Finch said. He looked at his bandaged hand. "That investigator, Robert. He is asking too many questions. He found the glass. He knows about the lantern." Sam was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the dark harbor. Robert is a good man, but he does not understand the whole story. He only sees the missing painting. He doesn't know about the treasure or the debt. "But what if he finds the warehouse?" Mr. Finch asked. "He already found it," a third voice said. Robert froze. The voice came from behind him. He started to turn around, but a heavy hand landed on his shoulder. It was a strong, firm grip. He didn't need to see the face to know who it was. The man in the raincoat had found him. "Stay very still, Mr. Robert," the man said. On the pier, Sam and Mr. Finch turned their heads toward the crates. Sam looked sad, but Mr. Finch looked terrified. The man in the raincoat pushed Robert forward, out of the shadows and into the grey light of the dock. "Look what I found watching you," the man in the raincoat said to Sam. Robert looked at Sam. "Sam, why?" "My father trusted you." Sam looked down at the wooden pier. "I am sorry, Robert. Some secrets are too heavy to keep, and some debts must be paid. You should have stayed in your office." Robert looked at Sam. He felt a deep sadness in his heart. Sam was his father's best friend. He had known Sam since he was a little boy. He could not believe that Sam was part of this crime. The man in the raincoat held Robert's arm very tightly. His grip was like iron. "What do we do with him, Sam?" the man in the raincoat asked. His voice was deep and cold. This was Leo, the man Mrs. Sterling mentioned. Sam looked at Robert for a long time. His eyes were full of regret. "Let him go, Leo. He is not a threat to us. He is just doing his job. Robert, please, take your car and go home. Do not come back to the docks tonight." Leo looked at Sam, then at Robert. He slowly released Robert's arm. "You are lucky, investigator. Sam has a kind heart. But my heart is not kind. If I see you here again, the ocean will be your new home." Robert did not speak. He knew he could not fight 3 men alone. He looked at Mr. Finch, who was hiding behind a large box. He looked at Sam, who turned his face away. Robert walked back to his car. His legs felt heavy. He felt like he had lost a member of his family. He drove away from the docks. The rain was stopping, but the wind was still strong. He did not go to the police yet. He needed to think. He needed to understand why Sam was helping Leo and Mr. Finch. Was it for the money? Or was there another reason? He drove to his office building. He wanted to sit in his quiet room and look at his notes. He walked up the wooden stairs. When he reached the top, he saw something that made him stop. The door to his office was wide open. The wood around the lock was broken. Robert entered the room slowly. He did not turn on the lights. He used his flashlight. The office was a disaster. His bookshelves were on the floor. His books were torn and scattered everywhere. His desk was turned over, and his computer was smashed. The person who did this was very angry. They wanted to destroy everything Robert had. He moved his flashlight around the room. The white papers on the floor looked like snow. He saw his father's old history books. They were ruined. Robert felt a wave of anger. This was his home, and they had violated it. Then, he saw his chair. It was the only thing in the room that was not broken. It was sitting in the middle of the mess. On the seat of the chair, there was an object. It was a small, blue lantern. It was lit. A soft, blue glow filled the center of the dark room. There was no note this time. The lantern was the message. It meant that the secret was now inside his office. They were telling him that they could find him anywhere. They were telling him that they were always watching. Robert sat on the floor among his ruined books. He realized that this was no longer just a case about a painting. It was a war. Robert did not sleep that night. He spent the hours cleaning his office. He picked up the heavy books and put them back on the shelves. He felt very tired, but his mind was busy. He kept looking at the blue lantern. Its light was small, but it felt powerful. He knew he needed to talk to Mrs. Sterling again. She was the only person who could explain the connection between the painting and the blue light. Early the next morning, the sun was trying to shine through the clouds. Robert drove to the mansion. The garden looked different in the morning light. The shadows were shorter, but the house still looked cold. He knocked on the large front door. Mrs. Sterling opened it herself. She was wearing a thick black sweater. She looked like she had been crying. "Mr. Robert," she said, "please, come in. I have been waiting for you." They went into the library. It was a warm room with many books and a large fireplace. Robert sat on a leather sofa. He did not waste any time. "I went to the warehouse last night, Mrs. Sterling," he said. "I saw Sam and Mr. Finch. I also saw a man named Leo. They are working together." Mrs. Sterling sat down slowly. She put her face in her hands. "I was afraid of that," she whispered. "Leo was my father's assistant many years ago. He was a very angry man. My father sent him away because he was stealing money." "But why do they want the painting?" Robert asked. "It is a beautiful painting. But is it worth all this trouble? Why did they break into my office?" Mrs. Sterling looked at a large, empty space on the library wall. It was another empty frame. Then she looked back at Robert. Her voice was very low and serious. "The painting is not just art, Robert," she explained. "My father was a very clever man. He did not trust banks. He turned his money into gold coins. He hid the gold in a secret place near the harbor many years ago." Robert leaned forward. He was listening very carefully. He wanted to make sure his family could find the gold if they ever needed it. She continued. "So, he hired an artist to paint the blue harbor. But the artist did not just paint a picture. If you look at the painting in a special way, you can see a map. The lines of the buildings and the position of the ships show exactly where the gold is hidden." "And the blue lantern?" Robert asked. "The map only appears under a specific light," Mrs. Sterling said. "You must use a blue cobalt lantern to see the hidden lines on the canvas. Without the lantern, the map is invisible. With the lantern, the painting shows the way to the treasure." Robert finally understood. The thief did not want to sell the painting. They wanted to use it to find the Sterling family gold. And now, they had the painting, they had the blue lantern, and they were ready to find the treasure. Robert thanked Mrs. Sterling and left the mansion. His mind was spinning with new information. The painting was not just art. It was a map to a hidden treasure of gold coins. And the only way to see the map was by using the light of a blue cobalt lantern. Now he understood why everyone was so desperate to find it. He had a new goal. He needed to find Victor Sterling again. Victor told Robert he was innocent at the club. But Robert did not believe him anymore. If the painting was a map to gold, Victor probably wanted it to pay his many debts. Robert drove back toward the center of town. He looked for Victor's red sports car. He did not see it at the Anchor Club, and it was not parked in front of Victor's apartment. Robert decided to drive toward the docks one more time. He had a feeling Victor was hiding somewhere near the water. After 10 minutes of driving, he saw the red car. It was parked behind a row of old, empty shops near the harbor. The area was very quiet, and most of the streetlights were broken. The fog was starting to return, making the air feel thick and wet. Robert parked his blue car a short distance away and walked quietly to the red car. He looked through the glass window. The inside of the car was very messy. There were empty coffee cups, old newspapers, and candy wrappers on the floor. Robert used his flashlight to look at the floor of the passenger side. He saw a pair of heavy leather boots. They were covered in thick, dark mud. It was the same dark, sandy mud Robert had seen at the beach house and inside Warehouse 42. Robert knew those boots had been at the crime scenes. Then, his light hit something else. On the passenger seat, there was a small, sharp object. It was another piece of blue glass. It was a perfect match for the piece Robert had found in the gallery. Robert felt a cold feeling in his chest. Victor was definitely lying. He was part of the plan to find the treasure. Robert tried to open the car door, but it was locked. He stood up and looked around the empty street. Suddenly, he saw a man walking toward him from the shadows of the shops. It was Victor. He was wearing a thin jacket and looked very angry. "What are you doing at my car, Robert?" Victor shouted. He did not look like the scared man from the club anymore. "I found the boots, Victor," Robert said firmly. "And I found the blue glass." You were at the beach house. You were at the warehouse. You helped Leo steal the painting. Victor stopped walking. His face was pale in the moonlight. He did not move for a long minute. Then, he let out a long breath and shoulders dropped. I had to do it. Robert. Victor said in a low, tired voice. I owe money to very dangerous people. If I do not give them the gold, they will hurt me. I am not a thief because I want to be. I am a man with no other options. Robert looked at the boots and then at Victor. Who is the leader? Victor. Is it Leo? Victor nodded slowly. Leo is the leader. He has the painting now. He is waiting for the tide to go down tonight. He wants to go to the harbor and find the gold. You must stay away. Robert. Leo is not like me. He is a very dangerous man. Robert realized that the secret was almost out. The treasure was about to be found, and he was the only one who could stop them. Victor turned his back on Robert and disappeared into the fog. Robert stood by the red car for a long time. He felt the cold wind on his face. He knew that the situation was very serious. The gold was real, and Leo was ready to take it. Robert looked at his watch. It was 10 o'clock at night. The tide would be at its lowest point at midnight. That was in 2 hours. Robert walked back to his blue car. As he reached for the door, his mobile phone began to vibrate in his pocket. He took it out. The screen showed an unknown number. He hesitated for a second. Then he answered. Hello. Robert said. Mr. Robert. A voice said. It was not Leo's cold voice, and it was not Sam's deep voice. It was a woman's voice, but it was not Mrs. Sterling. It sounded younger and very hurried. I know you are looking for the painting. I know about the map. Who is this? Robert asked. He gripped the phone tightly. That does not matter. The woman replied. What matters is the gold. Leo is not the only person who wants it. If you want to save the history of this town, come to the old lighthouse. Come alone at midnight. I will give you the Real painting. Why should I trust you? Robert asked. Because I have what you need. She said. The painting in the warehouse was a fake. I have the real Blue Harbor with me. If you are not there by midnight, I will give it to Leo. The line went dead. Robert looked at his phone. He had many questions. Who was this woman? Was it Elena, the librarian he had heard about? Or was it someone else? He didn't know. But he had to go. The lighthouse was at the very end of the rocky point, far from the town. It was a lonely place where the wind was always loud. Robert drove out of the town center. The road to the lighthouse was dangerous. It was narrow and sat on the edge of high cliffs. To his left, he could see the dark ocean. Huge waves hit the rocks below, making a heavy, white spray. The fog was so thick that he could only see a few feet of the road. He reached the end of the road at 20 minutes to midnight. The old lighthouse stood like a tall, white ghost against the black sky. It was no longer in use, and its windows were dark. The large light at the top was silent and cold. Robert parked his car and took his flashlight and his heavy coat. He walked toward the lighthouse. The path was made of sharp stones. He could hear the sound of the water hitting the cliffs. It was a powerful, deep sound that made the ground shake a little. He reached the heavy iron door of the lighthouse. To his surprise, it was slightly open. Robert pushed the door. It moved slowly, and made a long, scraping sound against the stone floor. He stepped inside. The air was wet and smelled of old salt. He turned on his flashlight. The beam of light hit a spiral staircase made of metal that went up into the darkness. I am here. Robert called out. His voice echoed up the stairs, but no one answered. He began to climb. Robert began to climb the spiral staircase. The metal steps were narrow and very rusty. Every time he took a step, the stairs made a low, groaning sound. He held the cold metal rail with one hand and his flashlight with the other. The light moved back and forth against the damp stone walls. The air was thick with the smell of old ocean water and wet earth. He reached the first floor. It was a small, circular room with a wooden floor. There was a broken chair and a dusty table, but no person. He continued to climb. The lighthouse felt like a giant, cold chimney. He could hear the wind howling outside the thick walls. It was a lonely, scary sound. When he reached the third floor, he stopped to rest. There was a small window here. He looked out and felt a sudden shock. The path he had walked on was gone. The ocean had risen very quickly. The waves were now hitting the base of the lighthouse. White foam flew up against the glass of the window. The tide. Robert whispered, "It is higher than I thought." Suddenly, a very loud noise came from the bottom of the tower. It was the sound of the heavy iron door slamming shut. The sound echoed up the stairs like a thunderclap. Robert turned and ran back down the stairs as fast as he could. His heart was pounding against his ribs. He reached the ground floor and grabbed the door handle. He pulled with all his strength, but the door did not move. It was locked from the outside. He pushed against the iron, but it was too heavy. "Is anyone there?" he shouted. "Open the door." No one answered. The only response was the sound of the wind and the waves. Then, Robert looked at the bottom of the door. A thin line of dark water was moving across the floor. The tide was so high that the ocean was starting to push inside the lighthouse. Robert realized the truth. There was no woman. There was no real painting at the lighthouse. The phone call was a trap to get him away from the harbor. Leo and his men wanted him stuck here while they found the gold. In a few hours, the water outside would be deep, and the lighthouse would be completely surrounded by the sea. He looked around the small ground room. The water was now covering his boots. It was freezing cold. He needed to find a way out, or he needed to find a way to stay dry until the morning. He looked up at the stairs. He had to go higher. He climbed back to the second floor and looked for a tool or a weapon. He was trapped in a stone cage, and the ocean was the key. He felt a deep anger at himself. He was a professional investigator, but he had walked right into their trap. He sat on the cold floor and looked at the blue lantern he had brought with him. It was his only light in the dark. Robert stood on the metal stairs. The cold ocean water was slowly moving up the first few steps. He knew he had to be fast. He looked at the ground floor one more time. In the corner, near the heavy iron door, there was a small wooden door. It was almost hidden by a large stone pillar. He had not noticed it when he first entered because it was so dark. He stepped back down into the freezing water. It was now at his knees. The water felt like ice against his skin. He reached the small door and pulled the handle. It was not locked. Inside, there was a tiny room. It was like a small cellar or a storage space. The floor here was a bit higher than the main floor, so it was still dry for now. Robert moved his flashlight around the small room. The light was getting a little weak, so he shook it. The beam hit several old objects. He saw many empty glass bottles and a pile of thick, yellow ropes. Then, his light hit a metal object on a high shelf. It was an old radio. It was covered in thick, grey dust. He picked it up with both hands. It was heavy and felt very cold. He tried to turn the buttons, but the radio stayed silent. There was no sound at all. He looked at the back of the radio. The battery compartment was empty. "I need to find batteries," he whispered. Next to the radio, he found something else. It was a long, dark coat hanging on a nail. He touched it. The coat was very wet. It did not smell like the old, dusty lighthouse. It smelled like fresh salt water and strong tobacco. Robert looked at the size of the coat. It was very large and heavy. He remembered the man in the raincoat he had seen at the docks. Was this his coat? Why would he leave it here? He searched the pockets of the wet coat. His fingers touched something small and hard. He pulled it out and held it up to his flashlight. It was a silver whistle on a black string. He also found a small piece of wood with a name carved into it. L. Thorne. Robert thought about the name. Mrs. Sterling had said the man in the raincoat was named Leo. This must be his full name. This lighthouse was not just a trap for Robert. It was Leo's secret hiding place. Leo had been here recently. Perhaps only an hour ago. Maybe he was the one who had locked the door and left Robert to the rising tide. Robert felt a mix of fear and excitement. He had found more evidence. But he was still a prisoner of the sea. He took the radio, the whistle, and the coat and went back to the stairs. The water was now covering the bottom 4 steps of the staircase. The sound of the waves hitting the outside of the tower was getting louder. It was a heavy, rhythmic thumping that made the stone walls shake. He sat on the 5th step and looked at the radio. He needed to find a way to make it work. He needed to talk to the outside world before the water reached the higher floors. He felt very alone. But he was not ready to give up. Robert sat on the metal stairs for a few minutes. The water was now reaching the 6th step. It was a dark, moving circle of cold. He stood up and climbed to the next floor. This room was a bit larger than the others. It had a small fireplace made of stone, but there was no wood to burn. The air was very cold and damp. He felt a shiver run through his body. He decided to put on the heavy coat he found in the cellar. It was much too big for him, but it was warm and thick. He moved his flashlight around the room slowly. The walls were made of large, grey stones. The light hit something strange near the fireplace. There were marks on the stone. He walked closer and held his light steady. Someone had used a sharp tool or a knife to cut letters into the wall. He read the letters one by one. William Sterling. Robert's heart stopped for a second. William Sterling was Mrs. Sterling's father. He was the man who built the great family business. He was the man who hid the gold coins. Why was his name here, inside an old, abandoned lighthouse? Under the name, there were some numbers. 1945. That was many years ago. Robert looked at the wall again. There were more marks below the date. They looked like a long list of days. Each date had a small line next to it. It looked like someone was counting the time. It looked like the work of a person who was waiting for a long time. Was he a prisoner here? Robert asked himself quietly. He touched the cold stone with his fingers. The letters were deep and rough. He imagined William Sterling sitting in this dark, lonely room, alone with his secrets. Maybe he did not just hide the gold. Maybe he was hiding from someone dangerous. Robert looked at the fireplace again. He saw a small piece of paper stuck between 2 stones. He used his fingers to pull it out carefully. It was a very old photograph. It was black and white, and the edges were yellow. It showed a young man and a young woman standing on a fishing boat. The man was definitely a young William Sterling. He looked happy. The woman next to him was not Mrs. Sterling's mother. She was someone else entirely. Robert noticed a small detail. The woman was wearing a small silver whistle around her neck on a black string. It was the exact same whistle Robert now had in his pocket. Robert felt like the mystery was getting much bigger. The Sterling family had many secrets that Mrs. Sterling did not tell him. This lighthouse was not just a trap for Robert. It was a place where the history of the town and the treasure began. Suddenly, he felt a heavy vibration. A giant wave hit the side of the lighthouse. The tower shook, and some dust fell from the ceiling. Robert knew he did not have much time left. The storm was getting stronger. He had to find a way to signal for help before the water reached the top. He looked at the silver whistle. He hoped someone could hear it over the loud wind. The night was very long. Robert sat on the cold metal stairs for many hours. He did not sleep because he was too cold. He listened to the waves hitting the stone walls of the lighthouse. It was a very loud and powerful sound. But slowly, the sound changed. The waves were not hitting the walls with the same force as before. He looked down into the darkness. He used his flashlight one more time. The water was moving away. It left the 6th step, then the 4th step. Finally, the ground floor was just wet and covered in dark mud. The tide was going down. Robert watched the small window. The sky was not black anymore. It turned a pale, soft gray, and then a little orange. The sun was coming up. Robert felt a little hope in his heart. He stood up and moved his arms and legs. His body felt very stiff and sore. He was very tired, but he knew he had to move. He walked down to the ground floor. He went to the heavy iron door. He remembered the silver key with the letter S in his pocket. He took it out with shaking fingers. He put the key into the large, old lock. He turned it slowly. The door was no longer locked. He pushed the door with all his strength. It was very heavy, but it moved. He stepped outside into the fresh morning air. The rain had finally stopped. The ground was covered in wet sand and long pieces of green seaweed. He took a deep breath. The air smelled like salt and wet earth. He felt lucky to be alive. He looked out at the ocean. The fog was very thin now. In the distance, about a mile away, he saw a small boat. It was moving quickly across the grey water. It was heading toward the tall cliffs on the other side of the bay. Robert watched the boat carefully. He saw a man standing at the back of the boat. The man wore a yellow jacket. It was Sam. Robert knew where they were going. They were heading toward the hidden sea caves. He looked at the boat until it was just a small black dot on the water. He turned and walked toward his car. His blue car was sitting on the path. It was covered in salt and sand, but it was safe. He started the engine. The car made a steady humming noise. He felt a new energy. He had survived the night, and now he knew the direction of the thieves. He had to reach the cliffs before they found the treasure. The mystery was almost finished, but the most dangerous part was still ahead. Robert drove his car fast along the cliff road. The sun was now fully above the ocean, casting a bright, golden light over the water. The storm had left the world looking clean and sharp. He kept his eyes on the coastline. He knew these cliffs well from his childhood. Locals called this area the Devil's Mouth because the rocks were sharp and the caves were deep and dangerous. He reached the high point overlook and stopped the car. From here, he had a clear view of the beach below. He saw the small boat again. It was pulled up onto the sand near a narrow opening in the rock wall. There was no one on the boat. Robert took his flashlight and the silver whistle from his pocket. He also took a heavy metal wrench from his car's toolbox. He didn't have a gun, but he needed something to protect himself. He began to walk down the narrow fisherman's path that led to the beach. The path was steep and covered in wet grass. One wrong step would send him falling onto the sharp rocks below. He reached the bottom of the cliff. The sand was dark and wet. He walked toward the opening in the rocks. It was a tall, thin crack in the cliffside. The air coming from the cave was freezing and smelled strongly of old seaweed and wet stone. Robert stepped inside. The transition from the bright morning sun to the dark cave made him go blind for a moment. He waited for his eyes to adjust. He did not turn on his flashlight yet. He moved slowly, feeling the damp walls with his hands. As he moved deeper into the cave, the sound of the ocean began to fade. The silence was heavy. Then, he saw it. A faint, glowing light was reflecting off the wet walls ahead. It wasn't yellow or white. It was a deep, haunting blue. He turned a corner and stopped. The cave opened into a large, circular room. In the center of the room, the man in the raincoat, Leo, was holding the blue cobalt lantern. Next to him, Sam and Victor were standing by a large, flat rock. They had the blue harbor painting resting on the rock. Under the blue light of the lantern, the painting looked completely different. The ships and buildings seemed to disappear, and a glowing set of lines and symbols appeared on the canvas. It was the map. "It's here," Leo said. His voice was full of excitement. "The map says the gold is behind the center pillar." Robert watched from the shadows. He saw Leo point to a thick column of stone at the back of the cave. Sam looked pale and tired. Victor looked like he wanted to run away. "Start digging," Leo commanded, handing a shovel to Victor. Robert knew he had to act now. If they found the gold, they would leave, and he would never be able to prove what happened. He took a deep breath and stepped into the blue light. "It's over, Leo," Robert said. His voice was loud and clear in the quiet cave. The three men jumped in surprise. Leo turned the blue lantern toward Robert, the light blinding him for a second. "You!" Leo hissed. "How did you get out of the lighthouse?" Leo did not wait for an answer. He dropped the blue lantern onto the flat rock and lunged toward Robert. He was surprisingly fast for a man his age. Robert stepped back, raising the heavy metal wrench to defend himself. "Stop it, Leo!" Sam's voice boomed through the cave. The old sailor stepped between them, his face set in a hard, determined line. "No more violence. We are here for the gold, not for blood." Leo stopped, breathing heavily. He glared at Robert but eventually stepped back toward the stone pillar. "Then tell him to stay back. If he interferes, I'll bury him in this cave." Robert kept his eyes on Leo but spoke to Sam. "Sam, why are you doing this? You told me you were my father's friend." "I am, Robert," Sam said, his voice softening. "But your father knew the truth about this gold. It wasn't just earned. It was taken from people who had nothing during the war. My family lost everything to the Sterlings. I'm just taking back what belongs to the town." Robert looked at Victor, who was already digging frantically behind the pillar. The sound of the shovel hitting the rocky earth was sharp and rhythmic. "Is that true, Victor?" Robert asked. Victor didn't look up. "I don't care about the history, Robert. I just need to get these people off my back." Suddenly, there was a loud metallic strike. The shovel hit something metal. Victor stopped, his eyes wide. He dropped the shovel and began to clear the dirt with his hands. Leo pushed him aside and reached into the hole. With a great effort, Leo pulled out a small iron chest. It was covered in rust and barnacles, held shut by a heavy padlock. The secret of the pillar. The cave was silent as Leo placed the chest on the flat rock next to the painting. Under the blue light, the map on the canvas seemed to point directly at the chest. Robert noticed a small keyhole on the side of the chest that matched the shape of the silver key he had found in the beach house. "The key, Robert," Leo said, turning slowly. "I know you have it. I saw you take it from the beach house." Robert reached into his pocket. He felt the silver key with the letter S. He also felt the silver whistle. He knew that the moment he gave up the key, he would lose his only leverage. "If I give you the key, you let Victor and Sam go," Robert bargained. "This is between you and the Sterlings." Leo laughed, a dry and hollow sound. "I don't care about them. Give me the key, and you can all walk out of here." Robert stepped forward, his heart racing. He held the key out. Leo reached for it, his eyes shining with greed. But as Robert handed over the key, he did something else. He raised the silver whistle to his lips and blew as hard as he could. The sound was piercing, a high-pitched scream that echoed and multiplied against the cave walls. It was the old Sterling signal, the one used to call the harbor patrol in emergencies. The sound of the whistle was like a physical blow. In the small, enclosed space of the cave, the noise was deafening. Leo dropped the silver key and covered his ears, his face twisted in pain. Victor fell to his knees, and even Sam stepped back, blinking in surprise. Robert did not wait. He lunged forward and grabbed the blue cobalt lantern from the rock. Without its light, the secret map on the painting vanished, leaving only the dark, familiar image of the harbor. He ran toward the back of the cave, away from the entrance. "Get him!" Leo screamed, his voice cracking. "Forget the whistle. Get that lantern." But the whistle had done its job. Far out on the water, the low, steady thrum of a powerful engine began to grow louder. A bright searchlight cut through the morning mist, sweeping across the face of the cliffs. The harbor patrol had been nearby, searching for the boat Sam had taken. "Sam, look." Victor pointed toward the cave entrance. The light was getting closer. "They are here. We have to go." Sam looked at the iron chest, then at Robert. He seemed to wake up from a dream. The greed and the old anger left his eyes, replaced by a deep exhaustion. "It's over, Leo. The patrol is here. If we stay, we go to prison for a long time." Leo ignored him. He picked up the silver key from the sand and jammed it into the chest's padlock. He turned it with a frantic, desperate strength. The lock snapped open. Robert watched from the shadows as Leo threw back the lid of the chest. He expected to see the bright, yellow glow of gold coins. Instead, Leo's face fell. He reached into the chest and pulled out a stack of old, leather-bound books and a small, wooden box. "Where is it?" Leo yelled, throwing a book onto the wet sand. "Where is the gold?" He opened the small wooden box. Inside were not coins, but a collection of old medals and a single, large sapphire set in a silver ring. Underneath the items was a letter, the paper yellow and brittle with age. Robert stepped forward, his curiosity overcoming his fear. "It wasn't a map to a treasure chest, Leo. It was a map to the family's history." The sound of the patrol boat was right outside the cave now. Boots splashed in the shallow water at the entrance. "Police! Stay where you are!" a voice commanded. Leo looked at the sapphire in his hand, then at the heavy books scattered in the mud. He realized that the wealth William Sterling had hidden was the proof of his family's true journey. Their struggles, their legal documents, and a few precious heirlooms. The gold was a legend built by the town's gossip over 80 years. Sam sat down on a rock and put his head in his hands. Victor looked relieved, even as the officers entered the cave with their flashlights held high. Robert lowered the blue lantern. The mystery of the Blue Harbor was finally solved, but it wasn't the ending any of them had expected. The cave was soon filled with the bright, clinical light of police flashlights. Leo was handcuffed quickly, his face a mask of bitter rage as he was led away. He had spent years chasing a shadow, only to find a box of paper and a single ring. Victor and Sam were taken more gently. They had cooperated as soon as the police arrived, the weight of their choices finally breaking them. Robert stayed behind for a moment with the iron chest. He picked up the yellowed letter that Leo had tossed aside. As the sounds of the harbor patrol faded, he began to read. "To those who find this, the gold of the Sterling family was never meant to stay in a box. In the dark years of the war, I saw families losing everything. I used our wealth to buy their safety, to pay their passages, and to keep this town from starving. These books are the records of those lives. The sapphire is all that remains of my mother's dowry. May it find a better use than greed." William Sterling, 1945. Robert sat on the flat rock, the blue harbor painting resting beside him. The blue light of the lantern was no longer needed. The true map wasn't to a hoard of coins, but to the heart of a man who had chosen people over profit. 1 week later, The sun was shining brightly over Blackwood when Robert made his final visit to the Sterling mansion. The air was crisp, and the smell of the sea was light and pleasant. Mrs. Sterling met him in the gallery. The empty space on the wall was gone. The blue harbour hung in its rightful place, cleaned and restored. "Thank you, Robert," she said softly, looking at the painting. "You didn't just find my father's art. You found his character. I never knew he had done those things." "The town knows now," Robert replied. "The museum is going to display those ledgers. Your father is a hero to many families here." Sam had been given a light sentence due to Robert's testimony and his help in the end. Victor was working to pay off his debts through the sale of the sapphire, which Mrs. Sterling had gifted to him to help him start over. Robert walked to the gallery window. He looked out at the garden where he had first seen the piece of blue glass. The mystery was over. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt since his father passed away. He reached into his pocket and touched the small silver whistle. He decided to keep it, not as a tool for a case, but as a reminder that the truth is often hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right light to reveal it. He shook Mrs. Sterling's hand and walked out of the great house. As he drove his blue car down the hill toward the town, he didn't look back. He had a new office to rebuild and a new reputation as the man who could find anything, even the truth. A week after the events at the Devil's Mouth, Robert's office was finally back to normal. The smell of fresh paint replaced the scent of damp dust, and new bookshelves lined the walls. Robert sat at his desk, turning the silver sapphire ring over in his hands. Mrs. Sterling had insisted he keep it for a few days to study it before it was sent to a secure museum vault. He reached for the blue cobalt lantern, which now sat permanently on his desk. He lit it, and the room was bathed in that familiar, haunting glow. He held the sapphire up to the light. At first, he saw nothing but the deep blue sparkle of the gem. But as he turned it slowly, the light passed through the stone at a specific angle. A tiny, microscopic engraving appeared, projected onto the white paper of his desk like a ghost. It wasn't a name or a map. It was a sequence of numbers and a small, stylized symbol of a key interlaced with a rose. "What are you, William?" Robert whispered. The door to his office opened. Victor Sterling walked in. He looked better, rested and cleaner, but his eyes were still filled with a nervous energy. He didn't look at the ring. He looked at the projection on the desk. "You found it," Victor said, his voice barely a whisper. Robert looked up, surprised. "You knew about this?" Victor sat down, leaning into the blue light. "My father used to talk about the 12 roses when he was late in his years. I thought it was just the rambling of a tired mind. He said the gold was just the beginning, that the real wealth of Blackwood was protected by 12 keys. 12 keys for 12 lanterns?" Robert asked, connecting the dots. Victor nodded. The blue lanterns weren't just for ships. They were for the founders. 12 families who built this town. Each family had a lantern, and each lantern revealed a different secret. My father had the first one. The painting led to his chest, but the chest was just a gateway. Robert looked at the sequence of numbers on his desk. 44.872, minus 67.144. "These are coordinates," Robert said, reaching for his map of the coastline. "And they don't point to the harbor. They point to the old forest on the northern edge of the town. The Blackwood Woods," Victor said, his face turning pale. "No one goes there. The land has been closed off for 50 years. "Then that's exactly where we're going," Robert decided. He realized that the mystery hadn't ended at the cave. It had simply shifted from the sea to the earth. The Blackwood Woods were a sharp contrast to the salty air of the docks. Here, the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp moss. The trees were old, their branches twisting together to block out the sun. Robert and Victor hiked in silence, following the coordinates Robert had marked on his GPS. The further they went, the more the forest seemed to change. The birds stopped singing, and the ground became covered in a strange, silver-grey lichen that crunched under their boots. Robert checked the coordinates again. They were standing in a small clearing where the trees grew in a perfect circle. In the center of the circle was a stone structure that looked like a small well, but it was covered by a heavy iron grate. The symbol of the rose and the key was carved into the stone. "This is it," Robert said. He knelt by the well and cleared away the dead leaves. He saw 12 small indentations around the rim of the stone. Each indentation was shaped like a small, square base, exactly the size of the blue lanterns. He expected all 12 families to come here. Victor realized. But the families are gone, Robert. Most of them left Blackwood decades ago, or their names died out. Not all of them, Robert said. He took out his notebook. "I've been researching the names in your father's ledgers. Mr. Finch is a descendant of the Finchley family, one of the original 12. And Sam. Sam's real last name is Beaumont. That's another one." Suddenly, a twig snapped behind them. Robert reached for his flashlight, but a voice stopped him. "You're quicker than your father was, Robert." An elderly woman stepped into the clearing. She was dressed in a long, dark green coat, and her silver hair was tied back in a strict bun. In her hand, she carried a blue cobalt lantern, its glass glowing softly even in the daylight. "I am Eleanor Vance," she said, "the keeper of the third lantern. And you, Mr. Robert, are trespassing on a history you don't yet understand." Eleanor Vance did not move from the edge of the circle. The blue light from her lantern cast long, flickering shadows against the ancient pines. Robert kept his hands visible, sensing that this woman held more authority in these woods than any police officer. Victor, however, looked as though he had seen a ghost. "The Vance family," Victor whispered. "My father said you were the guardians of the high ground. But the Vances left Blackwood after the Great Fire of '55. "We never left," Eleanor said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "We simply stopped being seen. When the town chose to forget the Founders Compact, we chose to wait. William Sterling was the only one who kept his word, even if he did hide the truth in a painting like a romantic fool." Robert stepped toward the stone well. "What is the compact, Eleanor? This isn't just about gold or family pride. Victor says there are 12 lanterns. We've seen 3. What happens when they are all here?" Eleanor walked to the well and placed her lantern in one of the square indentations. As the glass settled into the stone, a low, mechanical hum vibrated through the ground. A faint line of blue light traveled from the base of her lantern, tracing a path along the rim of the well toward the other empty slots. "Blackwood was built on a lie, Mr. Robert," Eleanor explained. "The founders didn't just find this land, they altered it. They built a series of underground channels to drain the marshlands and prevent the sea from reclaiming the valley. But nature is not so easily tamed. The channels require constant adjustment, a balance managed by a mechanism hidden beneath this forest." She looked down into the dark grate. "The 12 lanterns are the keys to the regulator. Each lantern represents a valve, a gateway. If the system isn't balanced, the town doesn't just flood, it sinks. The wealth the families protected was the knowledge of how to keep the town alive. But over time, the families grew greedy. They thought the secret could be sold, or used to blackmail the others." Robert looked at the empty slots. "And now?" "Now, someone is collecting the lanterns for a different reason," Eleanor said, her expression darkening. "They don't want to balance the system. They want to trigger the overflow. By flooding the lower town, they can clear the land for new development, destroying the old history and the evidence of their ancestors' crimes." "Leo," Robert said, the name tasting like lead. He wasn't just looking for gold. He was looking for a way to destroy Blackwood. "Leo is a pawn," Eleanor snapped. He is working for someone with a much longer memory. Someone who knows that if you control the water, you control the life of this town. Robert realized the stakes had shifted again. This wasn't a heist anymore. It was a race to prevent an environmental catastrophe. The sun began to dip below the horizon, turning the forest into a world of orange and deep purple. Eleanor led Robert and Victor to a hidden cabin a mile from the stone circle. Inside, the walls were covered in maps, not of the surface, but of the vast network of tunnels that ran beneath Blackwood. If we want to stop the overflow, we need the other 9 lanterns, Robert said, studying a map of the town's sewer and drainage system. We have the Sterling lantern, the beach house lantern, and yours. That leaves 9. One is in the mayor's office, Victor noted, pointing to a mark on the map. The mayor's family, the Whitakers, were the treasurers of the compact. And the judge, Eleanor added. Judge Halloway keeps his in the basement of the courthouse. But getting to them won't be easy. They are part of the Shadow Syndicate, a group of the remaining descendants who believe they can profit from the town's destruction. Robert felt a cold anger rising. The leaders of the town, the people meant to protect it, were the ones planning its demise. It was a classic betrayal, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and old money. We need a plan, Robert said. If we try to take the lanterns by force, we'll be arrested before we get past the front steps of the courthouse. We need to expose them. We need to show the people of Blackwood what is beneath their feet. Suddenly, the cabin's small window shattered. A heavy canister rolled across the wooden floor, hissing a thick, grey smoke. Out! Get out now! Robert yelled, grabbing the blue lantern from the table and shoving Victor toward the back door. They burst out into the cold night air, coughing and gasping. The forest was no longer silent. Robert could hear the sound of engines. Black SUVs were moving through the trees, their headlights cutting through the fog like the eyes of predators. They followed us, Victor gasped, leaning against a tree. How did they find us so fast? Robert looked at the silver sapphire ring on his finger. He had forgotten about the microscopic engraving. If it could project light, it could likely be tracked. He had been a beacon for the syndicate ever since he left his office. The ring, Robert whispered. It's a transmitter. He didn't have time to think. He pulled the ring off and threw it as far as he could into the thick brush to the south. Go north, he commanded. Head for the old quarry. We have to split up and meet at the town library in 3 hours. It's the only place they won't expect us to go. As Victor and Eleanor vanished into the shadows, Robert turned toward the approaching headlights. He wasn't going to run anymore. He needed to see who was behind the wheel of this conspiracy. Robert stood his ground as the lead SUV screeched to a halt just yards away, kicking up a spray of dirt and pine needles. The engine idled with a low, menacing growl. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He wasn't a thug or a hired mercenary. He was wearing a tailored wool coat and polished leather shoes that looked entirely out of place in the muddy forest. It was Mayor Whitaker. You have a habit of being in the wrong place at the right time, Mr. Robert, the mayor said, his voice smooth and devoid of any real emotion. Or perhaps it's the right place at the wrong time. It depends on your perspective. Robert held the blue cobalt lantern high, its light catching the mayor's cold, calculating eyes. I know about the regulator, Whitaker. I know you're planning to trigger the overflow. You're willing to drown half the town just to rebuild it in your image. Whitaker sighed, as if explaining a simple math problem to a slow child. Blackwood is dying, Robert. The foundations are rotting, the infrastructure is failing, and the history everyone loves so much is just a collection of debts and failures. By resetting the valley, we create a blank canvas. Modern, efficient, and, most importantly, profitable. The people in the lower town will be compensated. They'll move to the new developments on the ridge. Everyone wins. Except the people who die in the accident. Robert countered. The ones who can't get out in time. The ones whose lives you've decided are worth less than a new luxury hotel. The mayor stepped closer, the headlights behind him creating a terrifying silhouette. Progress requires sacrifice. Now, give me the lantern. You've had your fun playing detective. But this is a matter of state. You don't want to find out what happens to people who obstruct the town's safety measures. Robert looked at the lantern in his hand. He knew he couldn't win a physical fight against the men in the SUV. But he also knew the one thing Whitaker didn't. Eleanor and Victor were already gone. If you want the lantern, you'll have to find it. Robert said. With a sudden burst of energy, he turned and sprinted toward the edge of a steep ravine. He didn't jump. Instead, he swung the lantern in a wide arc, letting it fly deep into the darkness of the gorge. Get it! Whitaker screamed to his men. As the guards scrambled toward the ravine with flashlights, Robert dove into the thick underbrush in the opposite direction. He knew the forest better than they did. He crawled through the thorns and mud, his heart hammering against his ribs, until the sound of their shouting faded into the distance. He didn't have the lantern anymore, but he had something better. The mayor's confession, recorded on the small device he always kept in his coat pocket. 3 hours later, Robert arrived at the Blackwood Public Library. He was covered in mud, his coat was torn, and he was shivering from the cold. But he was alive. The library was a grand, neo-Gothic building that felt like a fortress in the middle of the town. The side door opened before he could even knock. Elena, the head librarian, stood there with a worried expression. She ushered him inside and quickly locked the door. "Victor and Eleanor are downstairs," she whispered. "They told me everything. Robert, you look terrible." "I've been better," Robert admitted, catching his breath. "Did they bring the other lanterns?" "Only Eleanor's," Elena said. "But we found something in the archives. My family were the keepers of the records, the 13th family. We weren't part of the regulator, but we were the ones who wrote the failsafe." She led him down into the basement, a labyrinth of rolling shelves and temperature-controlled rooms. In the center of the room, on a large oak table, lay a massive, ancient book bound in iron. Victor and Eleanor were leaning over it, their faces illuminated by a single lamp. "The 13th Protocol," Eleanor said, looking up at Robert. "There's a way to shut down the regulator from inside the town, without all 12 lanterns. But it requires access to the master valve, which is hidden directly beneath the town square." "But Whitaker has the town square crawling with maintenance crews," Victor added. "They're already preparing the charges to blow the old seals. We have less than 6 hours until the tide comes in. That's when they'll trigger the overflow." Robert looked at the book. The diagrams were complex, showing a series of interconnected gears and pressure sensors. "If we can get to the master valve, we can vent the pressure into the sea before it builds up. But we need a distraction. Something big enough to pull the mayor's men away from the square." "I can provide the distraction." Sam's voice came from the shadows of the stacks. Robert turned, surprised. Sam stood there, still in his yellow sailor's jacket, looking older but determined. "The harbor patrol isn't all corrupt, Robert. I have friends. We can start a fire at the docks. Controlled, of course. Whitaker will have to send his men to protect the shipping interests. It's his biggest source of income." Robert looked at his team, a disgraced brother, an old guardian, a librarian, and a repentant sailor. It was a ragtag group, but they were the only thing standing between Blackwood and the abyss. "Okay," Robert said, his voice hardening. "Sam, get the docks ready. Elena, find us the blueprints for the town square tunnels. Victor, Eleanor, you're with me. We're going underground." The entrance to the subterranean world was hidden behind a false wall in the library's deepest archive. As Elena pulled a heavy lever disguised as a shelf bracket, the stone floor groaned and shifted, revealing a narrow, steep staircase that smelled of ancient iron and damp earth. "These tunnels were built before the town above them," Eleanor whispered, her voice echoing in the confined space. "They follow the natural faults of the valley. The founders simply reinforced them with brick and stone to create a secondary circulatory system for the water." As they descended, the temperature dropped sharply. Robert led the way with his backup flashlight, the beam cutting through a thick, stagnant fog. They reached the bottom and found themselves in a massive gallery known as the Great Conduit. The walls were lined with rows of pipes, some made of modern steel, others of hollowed-out cedar bound with rusted iron bands. This was the intersection of 2 centuries of engineering, a chaotic fusion of the old world and the new. "We are directly beneath the main street now," Elena said, consulting a vellum map she had brought from the vault. "If Sam's distraction works, the pressure in these lines should drop as the harbor pumps are redirected to the docks. That's our window to reach the master valve without being drowned by a sudden surge." They moved quickly, their footsteps splashing in the shallow, oily water that coated the floor. Robert noticed sensors mounted on the walls, sleek, black devices with blinking red lights. The syndicate had rigged the tunnels with motion detectors. "Stay close to the walls," Robert hissed. "The shadows are deeper there. If Whitaker sees movement on his monitors, he'll trigger the seals early and trap us like rats." They reached a junction where 4 massive tunnels met. In the center stood a pillar of stone inscribed with the names of the 12 families. It was a monument to a pact that had turned into a conspiracy. Suddenly, a vibration moved through the stone beneath their feet. Then another. "Sam started," Victor said, his voice trembling. "The fire at the docks. We have to move. The syndicate will be checking the pressure gauges any second." They turned into the central artery, heading toward the town square. Above them, they could hear the muffled sound of sirens and shouting. The town was waking up to a manufactured crisis, unaware that the real threat was rising right beneath their feet. The tunnel opened into a vast, cathedral-like chamber directly beneath the town square. In the center sat the master valve, a colossal bronze sphere encased in a cage of interlocking gears and levers. It looked less like a piece of plumbing and more like the beating heart of a giant clockwork beast. "It's beautiful," Victor breathed, stepping into the chamber. "It's dangerous," Eleanor corrected. She pointed to a series of modern electronic actuators that had been bolted onto the ancient bronze. "The syndicate has bypassed the manual controls. They've linked the valve to a remote detonator. Look at the pressure gauge." Robert looked. The needle was deep into the red zone. The pipes surrounding the chamber were groaning, the sound of rushing water becoming a deafening roar. "The tide is coming in," Robert said, checking his watch. "The sea is pushing against the outer gates, and the regulator is held closed by Whitaker's program. If that valve doesn't open in the next 10 minutes, the pressure will blow the seals at the Main Street intersection. The lower town will be underwater in seconds." Elena ran to a control console that had been hastily installed near the valve. "It's encrypted. I can't override the syndicate's lock without a physical bypass." "The 13th protocol," Robert remembered. "The book said there's a manual release hidden inside the mechanism itself." "It requires the weight of 3 people to move the primary lever," Eleanor said, pointing to a massive iron bar near the base of the sphere. "And someone has to stay at the console to keep the electronic locks from re-engaging." Robert, Victor, and Eleanor grabbed the iron lever. It was slick with condensation and felt frozen in place. They pulled with all their strength. The metal shrieked, but it didn't budge. Again. Robert shouted over the roar of the water. Above them, they heard a new sound, the heavy rhythmic vibration of a drill. The syndicate's maintenance crew was drilling through the pavement of the town square, preparing to drop the final charges. "They're right on top of us." Victor cried out. "Ignore them." Robert yelled. "Pull! Now!" With a sound like a bone breaking, the lever shifted an inch. A deep, resonant hum began to vibrate through the bronze sphere. A small light on Elena's console turned from red to amber. "I have partial access." Elena screamed. "But the pressure is still climbing. We need to vent the secondary chambers or the backflow will destroy the valve." Robert looked at the complex web of pipes. He realized they were one person short. They needed someone to reach the manual vent on the far side of the chamber, but the floor was rapidly flooding as the primary seals began to leak. The water in the chamber was no longer a shallow puddle. It was a rising tide, swirling around their waists with freezing intensity. The roar of the pipes had become a scream of stressed metal. Above them, the vibration of the syndicate's drills grew louder, dust and small pebbles raining down from the vaulted ceiling. "We can't reach it," Victor shouted, pointing toward the far side of the bronze sphere. A secondary vent, a large wheel mounted on a vertical pipe, was separated from them by a churning whirlpool of dark water where a primary seal had failed. "The current is too strong. We'll be swept into the intake grates." Robert looked at the wheel. It was the only way to save the town, and it was barely 10 feet away, yet it might as well have been on the moon. Eleanor gripped the primary lever with white-knuckled desperation, her strength fading. Elena's console began to spark as the rising water reached the electrical housing. "I'm going to jump for it," Robert said, his voice hard. "You'll never make it, Robert." Elena cried. "The pressure will pull you under the moment you leave the platform." Suddenly, a splash echoed from the entry tunnel behind them. A small, trembling figure emerged, silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor. It was Mr. Finch. He was soaked to the bone, his glasses fogged, but in his hand, he carried a long, specialized iron hook, the kind used by glassmakers to move molten crucibles. "The Finchley family didn't just make the glass," Mr. Finch called out, his voice thin but clear over the roar. "We made the seals. We knew how the bronze expanded. I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't let Leo destroy what we built." Finch didn't hesitate. He knew the geography of the chamber better than any of them. He climbed onto a series of narrow copper pipes that ran along the wall, moving like a frantic spider. He used his long iron hook to snag the spoke of the secondary vent wheel from a distance. "Heave!" Finch screamed, leaning his entire body weight against the hook. Robert saw the opening. He lunged into the water, fighting the current, and grabbed the other side of the hook. Together, the investigator and the glassmaker pulled. The secondary vent groaned, resisting decades of rust, and then it spun. A massive jet of white steam and air hissed from the pipe, deafening and hot. The pressure needle on Elena's console finally began to flicker, moving away from the catastrophic red zone. "It's working!" Elena shouted, her hands flying over the keys. "The backflow is venting. The system is stabilizing." But the victory was short-lived. A loud crash echoed from above. A large section of the ceiling collapsed as a syndicate drill finally broke through the floor of the town square. A group of men in dark tactical gear began to rappel down ropes into the chamber, their suppressed rifles aimed directly at the group. The tactical team hit the water with practiced precision. Leading them was Leo, his face a mask of scarred fury. He held a detonator in his left hand, the red light glowing like a malevolent eye in the dim, steamy air of the vault. "Step away from the valve," Leo commanded. The sound of his voice was amplified by the acoustics of the chamber. "The mayor wanted a clean overflow, but I don't mind a messy one. If I press this, the charges in the upper seals will fire, and this whole cathedral will collapse on your heads." Robert stood his ground, the water chest-high now, still holding the iron hook with Mr. Finch. Victor and Eleanor remained at the primary lever. They were trapped, outgunned, and surrounded by the rising sea. "You won't do it, Leo," Robert said, his voice calm. "You're a thief, not a suicide. If this place collapses, you're the first one to drown. I have a rope, Leo sneered, glancing upward toward the hole in the ceiling. You have nothing but a broken dream. We have the 13th protocol, Elena said from the console. She looked at Robert, a silent question in her eyes. He nodded. Elena didn't type a code. Instead, she reached into the underside of the console and pulled a physical copper wire, touching it to a lead plate on the bronze sphere. It was the ancient failsafe, the kill switch designed by the librarians to protect the town from its own founders. A massive electromagnetic pulse rippled through the chamber. The sparks from the console turned into a brilliant blue arc. The tactical team's radios shrieked with static, and their electronic sights went dark. Most importantly, the red light on Leo's detonator flickered and died. The manual override is the only thing that works now, Leo, Robert said, stepping forward through the water. And we're the ones holding the levers. Leo looked at the dead detonator in his hand, then at his men, who were struggling with their dead equipment in the waist-deep water. For the first time, he looked truly afraid. He reached for a pistol at his hip, but the water was against him. The current, now venting safely toward the sea, was pulling him away from the center of the room. Victor! Eleanor! Full turn! Robert commanded. The trio at the primary lever gave one final, Herculean shove. The master valve rotated a full 360 degrees. With a sound like a giant indrawing of breath, the water in the chamber began to recede. The regulator had opened. The sea was no longer a threat. It was being funneled into the deep ocean trenches exactly as the founders had intended. The tactical team, caught off balance by the sudden change in water pressure, was swept toward the lower drainage grates. Leo tried to grab a pipe, but his wet hands slipped. He vanished into the dark overflow tunnel, his screams silenced by the rush of the water. Robert looked up at the hole in the ceiling. The sirens were still going, but the roar of the pipes had faded to a steady, peaceful hum. They had won. When Robert and his team finally climbed out of the hole in the town square, the world felt strangely quiet. The sirens were still wailing in the distance near the docks, but the immediate area was filled only with the sound of the morning wind and the soft hum of the town's now balanced plumbing. The drills stood silent, abandoned by the syndicate's men who had fled when the water began to recede. Mayor Whitaker was standing near his black SUV, his face pale and his hands shaking. He was staring at the hole in the pavement, waiting for the surge of water that never came. When he saw Robert emerge, soaked, muddy, but triumphant, the mayor's knees buckled. He knew the game was over. "You're too late, Robert," Whitaker stammered, his voice losing its polished edge. "The maintenance. It was a safety precaution. You've interfered with a municipal project." "Safety isn't triggered by a detonator, Whitaker," Robert said, his voice cold and raspy from the steam. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small digital recorder. He pressed the play button. The mayor's own voice echoed across the empty square, clear and damning. "Progress requires sacrifice. By resetting the valley, we create a blank canvas. Modern, efficient, and, most importantly, profitable." A fleet of state police vehicles rounded the corner, their lights reflecting off the wet pavement. They hadn't come for Sam's fire. They had come because Elena had sent the 13th Protocol's data directly to the Attorney General's office the moment the electromagnetic pulse hit. As the officers moved in to arrest the mayor and his remaining maintenance crew, Eleanor Vance stepped forward. She looked at the town she had spent decades protecting from the shadows. "The secrets of the founders are no longer secrets, Whitaker," she said. "They are history now. And history belongs to the people, not to your development board." Robert watched as they led the mayor away. He should have felt a sense of completion, but his mind was already racing back to the tunnels. Leo had been swept away, but the way he had looked at the valve, the sheer desperation, didn't match the mayor's profit-driven motive. Leo wasn't just working for a developer. He was searching for something else within the mechanism. "Victor," Robert said, turning to the younger Sterling. In the cave, Leo said the map pointed to the pillar. But under the blue light, did you see anything else? Anything the mayor wouldn't have cared about? Victor frowned, trying to remember the glowing lines on the blue harbor canvas. There was a secondary set of lines. I thought they were just ripples in the water of the painting. But they weren't blue. When the lantern tilted, they glowed silver. The following afternoon, Robert's office was once again a hub of activity. But this time the atmosphere was one of intense study rather than recovery. Elena had brought several leather-bound journals from the library's restricted section, the personal diaries of the 13th family, the archivists of Blackwood. The 12 lanterns were designed to balance the water. Elena explained, spreading a large, translucent map over Robert's desk. But Eleanor was right. The founders were men of ego. They didn't trust each other. They created a 13th lantern, the silver lantern. Robert leaned in. The failsafe. More than a failsafe. Elena said. The silver lantern was designed to illuminate the shadow ledger. While the blue lanterns showed the physical tunnels and valves, the silver light was meant to reveal the truth about the founders' debts and the real origin of the sterling fortune. Victor, who had been quiet, suddenly stood up. The mansion. My father's study has a section of the floor that always felt hollow. I thought it was just old wood. But after what we saw in the tunnels, I went back this morning. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in velvet. He placed it on the desk and unwrapped it. It wasn't cobalt. It was made of polished silver, with clear glass panes etched with delicate rosebuds. The silver lantern. Robert breathed. I found it behind a hidden panel in the floorboards. Victor said. But it's empty. No oil, no wick. It doesn't look like it was ever meant to burn a flame. Robert picked up the lantern. It was surprisingly light. He looked at the base and saw a small, circular indentation, exactly the size of the sapphire ring he had discarded in the forest. His heart sank. The sapphire. Robert whispered. The ring wasn't just a transmitter for the mayor to find us. It was the power source for this lantern. The light doesn't come from fire. It comes from the refraction of light through that specific stone. The mayor's men searched that ravine for hours. Victor said. They never found the ring. If someone else found it, someone like Leo, if he survived the tunnels, they have the key to the silver lantern. Robert looked out the window. The town was safe from the water, but a deeper, older mystery was beginning to surface. The silver lantern was the key to the shadow ledger, and whoever held it could rewrite the history of Blackwood, or destroy its families forever. We need to find that ring. Robert said. Before the tide brings it to the wrong person. The forest looked different in the cold, grey light of the following morning. The excitement of saving the town from the flood had worn off, replaced by a grim determination. Robert returned to the edge of the ravine where he had thrown the sapphire ring. He knew it was a long shot. The brush was thick, and the slopes were slippery with mud and rotted leaves. But he couldn't leave the key to the silver lantern in the wild. He brought a high-powered metal detector and a specialized UV light. If the sapphire had any residual charge from the blue lantern, it might still glow under ultraviolet rays. Victor stayed at the top of the ridge, acting as a lookout, while Robert tied a rope to a sturdy pine and rappelled down into the dark throat of the gorge. The air at the bottom was stagnant and smelled of damp decay. Robert began his sweep, the metal detector emitting a steady, low hum that echoed off the rocky walls. He moved slowly, his eyes scanning every crevice. Anything. Victor's voice drifted down from above, thin and distorted. Not yet. Robert called back. It's like a graveyard down here. He spent hours sifting through the debris. He found rusted tin cans, old logging chains, and even a discarded horseshoe. But no silver ring. Just as he was about to give up, his UV light caught a faint, pulsing flicker beneath a pile of silver-grey lichen near the base of a jagged rock. Robert knelt, his heart racing. He carefully brushed away the moss. It wasn't the ring. Instead, he found a small, metallic cylinder, no larger than a lipstick tube. It was etched with the same rose and key symbol. He realized it was a Dropbox, a secret message container used by the founders' families to communicate without meetings. He unscrewed the cap. Inside was a piece of parchment that looked much newer than the others he had found. The handwriting was sharp and modern. "The ring is safe. The mayor was a fool to think he could control the tide. Meet me at the old mill at midnight if you want to know what the Sterling family really owes the Beaumonts." Robert stood up, the cylinder clutched in his hand. The message wasn't for him. It was for Sam. Or perhaps it was for Leo. But the mention of the Beaumonts, Sam's real family name, suggested that the alliance between the families was much more complicated than a simple theft. "Robert, someone's coming." Victor's shout from above was urgent. Robert looked up and saw the flash of a dark coat at the top of the ridge. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't the mayor's men. It was a single figure, standing perfectly still, watching them. Before Robert could signal Victor, the figure turned and vanished into the trees. The old mill sat on the outskirts of Blackwood, a decaying wooden structure where the river ran fast and cold. It was a place of shadows and creaking timber. Robert arrived alone at midnight, despite Victor's protests. He had left the metal cylinder on his desk, bringing only his flashlight and the silver lantern, though it remained dark without the sapphire. He entered the mill through a side door that hung loosely on its hinges. The sound of the rushing water beneath the floorboards was a constant, low growl. "I have the message," Robert announced to the darkness. "Show yourself." A match flared in the corner, illuminating a face Robert didn't expect to see. It wasn't Sam, and it wasn't a syndicate thug. It was Lydia Beaumont, Sam's younger sister, whom everyone believed had moved away years ago. She was holding the sapphire ring between her thumb and forefinger. "My brother is a good man, but he's weak," Lydia said, her voice steady. "He wanted to take back what was stolen through a petty heist. He didn't realize that the Sterlings don't just owe us money. They owe us the truth about the 1945 fire." Robert watched the ring. In the darkness of the mill, the sapphire seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The fire that destroyed the Beaumont estate. The fire that was started to hide the fact that the Sterling gold was actually Beaumont gold. Lydia corrected. She stepped forward and held the ring over the silver lantern in Robert's hand. "Do you want to see the shadow ledger, Mr. Investigator? Do you want to see the blood on the roses?" Robert hesitated. He knew that revealing this truth would destroy the Sterling family's reputation forever. It would break Mrs. Sterling and ruin Victor. But he was an investigator. His job was the truth. "Put the ring in," Robert said. Lydia dropped the sapphire into the circular indentation at the base of the silver lantern. Instantly, the lantern didn't glow blue. It emitted a sharp, silver beam that cut through the dust of the mill. The light hit the far wall, but instead of showing a map, it projected a series of high-contrast images, signatures on deeds, bank transfers dated June 1945, and a handwritten confession signed by William Sterling himself. The shadow ledger was a digital-analog hybrid, a secret hidden in the very glass of the lantern. It showed that the treasure in the cave was a diversion. The real wealth had been laundered through a series of shell companies that still existed today. Companies that owned half the land in Blackwood. The Sterlings didn't build this town, Lydia whispered, her eyes fixed on the wall. "They bought it with our lives." Suddenly, the floorboards behind them groaned. Robert turned, his light hitting a figure in a wet, tattered raincoat. It was Leo. He looked half dead, his skin pale and his eyes bloodshot, but he held a heavy iron pipe in his hand. He hadn't been swept away. He had survived the tunnels, and he had followed the silver light. The ledger. Leo wheezed, his voice a ghost of its former self. It's mine. I'm the only one left who knows how to cash those checks. Leo stood in the doorway of the old mill, a tattered ghost of the man who had once commanded the syndicate's muscle. His breath hitched in his chest, a wet, rattling sound that competed with the roar of the water beneath the floorboards. He didn't look like a mastermind anymore. He looked like a cornered animal, driven by a decade of resentment and the freezing cold of the tunnels that had nearly claimed his life. The shell companies. Leo rasped, his eyes fixed on the silver projections on the wall. William Sterling didn't just steal the Beaumont's gold. He stole their future. Those companies own the title deeds to the ridge, the timber rights, and the very ground the library stands on. Whoever holds the shadow ledger holds the keys to the kingdom. Lydia Beaumont didn't flinch. She held the silver lantern steady, the sapphire ring pulsing within its base. You don't want justice, Leo. You want to be the new William Sterling. You want to trade one tyrant for another. Leo lunged. Despite his injuries, he moved with a frantic, desperate energy. Robert stepped forward, swinging his heavy flashlight. But Leo was low and fast. He tackled Robert around the waist, the two of them crashing into a stack of old, rotted flour sacks. Dust exploded into the air, thick and choking. Robert fought to stay upright, but the floorboards beneath them were soft with age. Every movement felt like a gamble with gravity. Leo's hands, cold as river stone, clawed at Robert's coat, searching for the silver lantern. Robert managed to shove Leo back, but the villain swung the iron pipe in a wide, clumsy arc. It smashed into a support beam, sending a shower of splinters into the air. Lydia, get out of here! Robert shouted, coughing through the dust. I'm not leaving without the truth. She replied, but she was forced to retreat as the heavy machinery of the mill began to groan. The vibration of the fight had disturbed the precarious balance of the rusted water wheel outside. The central axle of the mill began to turn, slowly at first, then with a violent, rhythmic thumping. The gears, seized by decades of rust, shrieked as they were forced back into motion by the surging river. The floor began to tilt. Leo ignored the danger. He scrambled toward Lydia, his fingers inches from the lantern. Robert grabbed a length of rope hanging from the ceiling and swung himself across the gap, kicking Leo squarely in the chest. Leo flew backward, crashing through a weak section of the railing. For a terrifying second, he dangled over the churning white water of the mill race below. Robert stood at the edge, gasping for air. The silver light from the lantern was flickering as the sapphire shifted in its housing. The projections on the wall blurred, signatures and dates dancing like ghosts in the dark. Leo hauled himself back up onto the tilting floor, his face a mask of mud and blood. He looked at Robert, then at the lantern, and finally at the churning water below. He realized he couldn't win a physical fight in a collapsing building. His eyes darted to the silver lantern one last time. You think you're the hero, Robert? Leo spat, wiping blood from his lip. If you reveal that ledger, you destroy the town. Every deed, every loan, every property line in Blackwood will be tied up in court for the next 50 years. You'll bankrupt the families who had nothing to do with William's crimes. You'll save the Beaumont's ghost by killing the living town. Lydia's hand trembled. She looked at the wall where the confession of William Sterling was still visible. His lying. She whispered, though her voice lacked its earlier certainty. He's not entirely wrong. Robert said, his eyes never leaving Leo. A legal collapse of that scale would be a disaster. But keeping a lie alive is what brought us to this mill, Lydia. It's what put a detonator in the mayor's hand. The mill gave a sudden, violent lurch. A support beam snapped. The roof groaned, and a section of shingles slid off, revealing the cold, indifferent stars above. Give me the lantern, and I disappear. Leo offered, his voice dropping to a low hiss. "I'll take the companies. I'll take the secrets. And Blackwood can keep its comfortable lie. No one has to know the Sterlings were thieves." "No," Robert said. Before Leo could react, Robert reached out and snatched the sapphire ring from the base of the lantern. The silver light vanished instantly, plunging the mill into near-total darkness, save for the weak beam of Robert's flashlight. "The light is gone, Leo," Robert said. "And the bridge is out. The police are on their way." Victor told them everything about the secret panel. Leo roared in frustration and charged one last time, but the floor gave way beneath him. With a sickening crack of wood, the villain disappeared into the dark void. This time, there was no railing to catch him. A loud splash followed, muffled by the roar of the river. Robert grabbed Lydia's hand and pulled her toward the side exit just as the central axle sheared through its housing. They burst out into the cold night air, tumbling onto the wet grass as the old mill finally surrendered to the river. The structure folded in on itself, a slow-motion collapse of timber and history, sinking into the dark water. Lydia sat on the grass, clutching the empty silver lantern. Robert stood over her, his hand closed tightly around the sapphire ring. They were both alive, but the shadow ledger, the physical evidence projected on the wall, was gone, buried under tons of rotted wood and silt. "It's over," Lydia whispered. "The proof is gone." "Not all of it," Robert said, reaching into his inner pocket and pulling out his digital camera. He had been recording the entire time. "I have enough." The morning after the collapse of the old mill, the town of Blackwood felt like a place held in suspension. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the air was unusually still. Robert sat in his car outside the Sterling mansion, the sapphire ring resting in his open palm. It looked small and harmless, yet it was the catalyst for a century of secrets. He walked up the marble steps, his boots still caked with the grey mud of the riverbank. Victor Sterling opened the door before Robert could knock. The young man looked as though he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were rumpled, and his eyes were rimmed with red. "Lydia called me," Victor said, stepping aside to let Robert in. "She told me what happened at the mill. She told me about the ledger." "Where is your mother?" Robert asked, his voice low. "In the library," Victor replied. "She's been waiting for you." They found Mrs. Sterling sitting by the cold fireplace. She wasn't reading or sewing. She was simply staring at the empty space on the wall where the blue harbor had once been stolen. When Robert entered, she didn't move, but her voice was steady. "My father was a man of great ambition, Robert," she began, without looking up. "I always knew there were shadows in his past. You don't build a kingdom like this in a small town during a war without making choices that leave scars." But to hear that he took the Beaumont's legacy, that he started a fire to hide his theft. Robert sat across from her. He took out his digital camera and placed it on the table. "I have the images, Mrs. Sterling. The deeds, the signatures, and the confession. It's all here. Legally, the Beaumonts have a claim to almost half the Sterling estate, including the land under the town's most vital buildings." Mrs. Sterling finally looked at him. Her face was aged with a sudden, heavy grief. "If this goes to the courts, Blackwood will be torn apart. The legal battles will last for generations. The syndicate wanted to drown the town in water. This will drown it in paper and bitterness. Lydia wants justice," Robert said. "And she's entitled to it. But I think there's more to the story. I don't think William Sterling was just a thief. If he was, why create the silver lantern? Why leave a confession that could be found?" Robert opened the camera's playback and zoomed in on a specific page of the ledger. It wasn't a deed or a bank transfer. It was a list of names, hundreds of them, with small notations in the margins. "These aren't shell companies." Robert observed, pointing to the screen. "These are trusts. Your father didn't just hide the money, he protected it. During the 1945 crisis, he moved the assets into these obscured accounts to keep them out of the hands of the creditors who were circling the town. He took the Beaumont's gold, yes, but look at where the dividends went." Robert and Victor spent the next 6 hours in the library, joined by Elena from the library, who brought the 13th protocol records to cross-reference with Robert's images. As they peeled back the layers of the shadow ledger, a different picture of William Sterling began to emerge, one far more complex than a simple villain or hero. He used the Beaumont gold as collateral. Elena explained, her finger tracing a complex diagram of the shell company's relationships. By creating these layers of ownership, he made it impossible for the state to seize the land for unpaid war taxes. He effectively turned the town's core into a private trust. As they reached the final images of the recording, Robert noticed a small, handwritten note at the very bottom of the last page. It was written in a different ink, dated only months before William Sterling's death. "The debt is not forgotten. The Beaumont line must be restored when the tide is right. Look to the 13th rose." The 13th rose. Victor whispered. "That was the name of the old lighthouse garden. My father spent his last days there, planting roses that never bloomed." "It's not a flower, Victor," Robert realized, standing up. "It's a location." The silver lantern had a rosebud etched into the glass. When the light hit the wall in the mill, it wasn't just projecting the ledger, it was projecting a coordinate map. Robert grabbed his notes from the mill. He remembered the silver light dancing on the rotted wood. He had thought the blurring was due to the collapsing floor, but it was intentional. The light had been showing a specific point in the harbor, marked by a symbol of a rose. William Sterling didn't just confess. Robert said to the room. He left a way to pay the debt back. He didn't want the town to be destroyed by lawyers. He left a physical asset, something he bought with the Beaumont gold and hid away, waiting for someone with a silver lantern to find it. "But the mill is gone," Elena noted sadly. "The lantern is empty, and the recordings you have only show parts of the map." "I have the sapphire," Robert said, holding up the ring. "And I have the coordinates I saw before the floor gave way. It points to the old customs house, the one building the mayor was so desperate to demolish during the maintenance work." Suddenly, the phone on the desk rang. It was Sam, calling from the police station where he was being held for questioning. His voice was frantic. "Robert, you have to get to the customs house. The syndicate isn't done. Whitaker's legal team just filed an emergency condemnation order. They're moving in with a wrecking ball in 2 hours. They know what's in the basement, Robert. They've always known." The race wasn't against the tide anymore. It was against the clock. The truth of Blackwood's history was buried in the one place the villains were about to turn into rubble. The old customs house was a skeletal remains of a building, a Victorian-era relic that had stood guard over Blackwood's harbor for over a century. Now, it was surrounded by yellow tape and the heavy, yellow machinery of a demolition crew. A massive wrecking ball dangled from a crane like a pendulum of doom, swaying slightly in the coastal wind. Robert pushed his blue car to its limit, skidding to a halt just as the foreman raised a megaphone. "Clear the area. Demolition begins in 5 minutes." Robert jumped out, followed closely by Victor. "Stop!" Robert shouted, flashing his investigator's badge, though he knew it carried little weight against a municipal order. "This building is an active crime scene. There is evidence inside that pertains to the syndicate investigation." A man in an expensive grey suit stepped forward from behind a line of security guards. It wasn't the mayor, but his lead counsel, a man with a cold, shark-like smile. "Mr. Robert, I believe the condemnation order is signed by the acting magistrate. The structure is unstable. For the safety of the public, It must come down. Now. It's not about safety, Robert countered, stepping toward the main doors. It's about what's in the vault. You know about the Beaumont Trust, don't you? You know that if that building falls, the physical records of the shell companies are destroyed, and the syndicate keeps the land titles through default. The lawyer's smile didn't waver. Foreman, proceed. The crane's engine roared to life. The wrecking ball began its slow, heavy swing. Robert didn't think. He ran. He dodged a security guard and dived through a broken window into the dusty, dark interior of the customs house. Victor was right behind him, the two of them disappearing into the gloom just as the first impact shook the building. The sound was deafening. Dust rained down from the high ceilings, coating everything in a thick, grey powder. The floor groaned, and a chandelier made of tarnished brass swayed violently. The basement! Robert yelled over the thunder of the second strike. We have to find the vault before the second floor collapses on us. They found the stairs, a narrow spiral of cast iron that felt like it was vibrating apart. At the bottom, they were met with a heavy steel door, far more modern than the rest of the building. It had no keyhole, only a smooth circular indentation in the center of a glass plate. The ring! Victor gasped, pointing to the plate. It's not just a power source for a lantern. It's an optical key. Robert pressed the sapphire ring against the glass. For a heartbeat. Nothing happened. Then, a faint silver light pulsed from the stone, reacting to a sensor behind the plate. A series of heavy bolts slid back with a rhythmic motion. The door opened, revealing a room filled with rows of pristine, metal filing cabinets and a single, ornate wooden desk. The room was a time capsule. While the building above was literally being hammered into rubble, the vault was silent and cool. Robert moved to the desk, where a single leather-bound ledger lay open. Next to it was a small, velvet-lined box. Outside, a third impact hit. A crack appeared in the basement ceiling, and a trickle of sand began to pour down. The wrecking ball was hitting closer to the foundation now. We don't have time to read, Victor shouted, grabbing a stack of documents from the nearest cabinet. We have to take what we can and get out. Robert ignored him for a moment, his eyes fixed on the velvet box. He opened it. Inside wasn't gold or jewelry. It was a collection of 12 small, silver seals, the original family crests of the founders. And in the center, a 13th seal, a rose interlaced with a key. These are the original titles. Robert realized, leafing through the ledger. William Sterling didn't just hide the money. He kept the original, unedited deeds for every inch of Blackwood. These aren't just copies. They are the legal primaries. If we have these, the syndicate's shell companies have no standing. The land reverts to the families immediately. He shoved the ledger and the box of seals into his heavy coat. Victor, grab the files marked Beaumont. We're leaving. As they turned to the door, a massive tremor shook the vault. A support beam above the stairs snapped, and a cascade of bricks blocked their exit. The air became thick with choking dust. They were trapped in the vault, and the building above was about to collapse. The ventilation shaft. Robert pointed to a small, grated opening high on the back wall. It leads to the harbor wall. It's the only way out. They scrambled up a stack of filing cabinets. Robert used his heavy wrench to smash the grate. One by one, they squeezed into the narrow, cold tunnel. The sound of the customs house's final moments echoed behind them, a prolonged, agonizing roar of stone and timber as the structure finally gave way. They emerged onto the rocky pier, coughing and gasping for air, just as a cloud of dust billowed out from the ruins of the building. The demolition crew and the lawyer were standing by the crane, staring at the pile of rubble with an air of grim satisfaction. It's gone, the lawyer said, though he sounded less certain when he saw Robert and Victor standing on the pier, covered in dust but holding the iron box of seals. Not quite. Robert said, raising the ledger. You destroyed the house, but you saved the evidence. In this town, the foundations are made of more than just brick and mortar. The sirens of the state police were once again filling the air. This time, they weren't just here for the mayor. They were here for the lawyers, the developers, and the last remnants of the syndicate. Robert looked at the sapphire ring on his finger. Its work was finally done. The days following the collapse of the old customs house were a whirlwind of legal filings, depositions, and town hall meetings. The shadow ledger and the 13 silver seals had changed everything. Blackwood was no longer a town of mysteries. It was a town in transition. Robert sat in his office, which now felt less like a private investigator's den and more like a historical archive. The sapphire ring sat in a velvet-lined case on his desk, its blue heart quiet for the first time in weeks. Across from him sat Lydia Beaumont and Victor Sterling. Between them lay the original deeds Robert had pulled from the vault. The audit is complete. Robert began, his voice weary but satisfied. The shell companies the syndicate used have been dismantled. Because William Sterling kept the primary deeds in that vault, the land doesn't just go into legal limbo. It reverts to the original families, or their closest living descendants. Lydia looked at the documents. So the Beaumonts own the ridge again, and the timber rights. And the Sterlings own the library and the park. Victor added, looking at Robert. But we've talked about it. Robert, my mother and I don't want to hold the town hostage with old debts. We're turning the land over to a community land trust. The Sterling family will be a part of it, but we won't be the masters of it. Lydia nodded. Sam and I agree. We're using our portion to rebuild the lower town, not for luxury hotels, but for the people who were almost drowned in Whitaker's progress. The Beaumont legacy will be the restoration of Blackwood, not its division. Robert felt a profound sense of relief. The cycle of greed that had started in 1945 was finally broken. But as the conversation turned to the future, Robert's mind drifted back to the one loose thread. Leo Thorne is still missing. Robert noted. The police searched the river for miles. They found his coat near the breakwater, but no body. And the silver lantern, it was lost in the collapse of the mill. He's gone. Robert. Victor said, trying to be convincing. No one could have survived that fall and the current of the mill race. Robert wasn't so sure. Men like Leo had a way of clinging to life when there was still a secret left to sell. That night, Robert walked down to the harbor. The air was cold, and the smell of salt was sharp. He found himself standing at the end of the pier, looking out at the old lighthouse. It stood tall and silent, its lights still dark. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object he hadn't shown anyone. It was a shard of glass he had found in the ruins of the customs house vault, separate from the seals. It wasn't clear, and it wasn't blue. It was a deep, iridescent black, and it was etched with a single word: remembrance. He looked at the lighthouse and realized that the 12 lanterns of the founders and the silver lantern of the archivist weren't the whole story. There had always been a 14th, the black lantern. It wasn't for water, and it wasn't for truth. It was for the town's grief. A shadow moved at the edge of his vision. Robert didn't reach for his wrench or his flashlight. He simply waited. You have the shard. A raspy voice whispered from behind a stack of lobster crates. Leo Thorne stepped into the dim light of the pier. He was a ghost of his former self. His arm was in a makeshift sling, and his face was a map of bruises and scars, but his eyes were clear. He wasn't carrying a pipe or a gun. He was carrying a heavy, black iron frame that lacked its glass panels. I found the frame in the river, Leo said, his voice a dry wheeze. The mill didn't destroy it. It just returned it to the sea. Why come back, Leo? Robert asked. The police are looking for you. The syndicate is finished. There's nothing left to steal. I'm not here to steal, Leo said, stepping closer. He held out the frame. I spent my life thinking the Sterlings were the villains. I thought if I found the gold, I could be the one on top. But I saw the ledger in the mill. Robert. I saw what they did for the town. I saw that my own father was one of the ones who helped William Sterling hide the truth. Leo placed the black frame on the pier between them. The black lantern is the only one that can light the lighthouse again. Not with oil, but with the combined light of the others. It was meant to be a memorial, a way for the town to acknowledge its scars so it could finally heal. Robert looked at the shard in his hand, then at the frame. He realized that the story of Blackwood wouldn't be complete until the lighthouse shone again, not as a warning, but as a beacon of shared history. Help me put it together, Robert, Leo said. Then I'll turn myself in. I don't want to be a ghost anymore. The climb up the spiral stairs of the lighthouse felt different this time. There was no rising tide to fear, no heavy iron door locked by an enemy. Robert led the way, followed by Victor and Lydia, who carried the restored silver lantern. Behind them, escorted by Sam and a local officer, came Leo Thorne. He moved slowly, clutching the black iron frame like a holy relic. Eleanor Vance waited at the top, her old cobalt lantern already positioned in the central housing of the Great Lens. The founders designed this for a moment that they hoped would never come. Eleanor said, her voice echoing in the small glass room at the summit. A moment when the town's heart was broken, and only a shared light could mend it. Robert took the iridescent black shard and carefully fitted it into the iron frame Leo provided. It clicked into place with a sound of perfect alignment. Victor handed over the sapphire ring, and Lydia placed the silver lantern into the final slot. The assembly was a complex web of history. The blue of the workers, the silver of the archivists, and the black of the town's collective memory. As the gears began to turn, Robert stepped back. He checked the alignment of the lenses. This wasn't just a lamp. It was a Fresnel system designed to blend the different frequencies of light. The sapphire acted as the primary oscillator. Its blue light refracted through the silver and black glass until the colors merged into a single, brilliant beam of pure, prismatic white. Now, Robert whispered. He struck a match and lit the central wick. For a second, the room was filled with a thick, warm smell of oil and salt. Then, the light hit the lenses. A magnificent beam shot out across the dark Atlantic, cutting through the fog like a physical blade. It didn't just flash, it pulsed with a rhythmic steady beat, like a heart. Below, in the town square and on the docks, the people of Blackwood stopped and looked up. For the first time in 80 years, the lighthouse was alive. Leo Thorne looked out at the beam, a single tear tracking through the soot on his face. "It's beautiful," he said quietly, before turning to the officer and offering his wrists for the cuffs. He had found his truth, and with it, his peace. As the sun began to rise, painting the horizon in shades of pink and gold, Robert stood on the gallery walkway. He looked down at the town he had saved, not just from a flood, but from its own shadow. The blue harbor painting was more than a map. It was an invitation to look deeper, to find the gold in the people rather than the dirt. "What now, Robert?" Victor asked, standing beside him. Robert looked at the sapphire ring, glowing softly in the morning light. "Now," he said with a small smile, "I think I'll go back to my office. I have a feeling the next case won't be quite as quiet."